around the table and on the phone, and then we'll kick it off. Okay. Good morning. Welcome, everybody. I'm Donna Hershkowitz. I'm the Chief of Programs here at the State Bar of California. This is the second meeting of discussions with law school deans. We had a meeting in San Francisco on Tuesday, and with mostly Northern California area deans. We're glad to have the opportunity to bring Southern California area deans, or those of you who couldn't attend on Tuesday from the Bay Area, joining us as well today. We are webcasting the meeting. We also have a conference line open for those who could not attend the meeting. The purpose of today's meeting is to talk about two issues that were deferred from the Board of Trustees decision making in September, and that deals with the ongoing engagement with between the bar and the law schools, as well as accreditation issues. But before we dig into any of that, if we can go around the table and on the phone and find out who's with us. So starting here in the room.
I'm Chet Saluga from the American Institute of Law and the Dean of Administration.
Darren Greitzer, Dean of Glendale University College of Law.
Good morning, George Leal, Dean of the Irvine University College of Law.
Good morning, Jay Frickberg, University of West Los Angeles.
Good morning, Sherry Diamond, Dean of Academics, Pacific Coast University School of Law.
Good morning, Marty Carmona, Dean of Students at Pacific Coast University School of Law.
Andrea Loa, Dean of PCU.
Elizabeth Sayre, Dean of Academics, Monterey College of Law.
Jackie Gardina, Dean at Santa Barbara Ventura Colleges of Law.
Mitch Winnick, President and Dean of Monterey College of Law.
Marty Kernigan, Dean of Concord Law School at Purdue University Global.
Robert Strauss, Dean of Taft Law School.
William Hunt, Dean of California School of Law.
Esther Lynn, Committee of the Bar Executives.
Ira Spiro, Dean of People's College of Law.
Susan Prager, the Dean at Southwestern and a long time ago Dean at UCLA.
And I did not introduce myself. I'm Leah Wilson, the Executive Director of the Bar. And just to help me out, can those of you from ABA schools raise your hand just so I have a sense?
There's only one.
Okay, all right.
On the phone, if you'd be so kind as to introduce yourself as well. Okay.
Hi, this is Greg Brandis, St. Francis School of Law.
Good morning.
Okay, all right. So we wanted to start off by just providing a little bit of context for the meeting that we're having today. And the context, I think, really begins decades ago when there began to be a call for reform at the State Bar, or I should say calls for reform at the State Bar. One of the seminal representations of that call for reform was a report issued, the Monterey Commission report, I believe in either 1980 or 1984, which had hundreds of recommendations for reform at the State Bar. We found many years later, when we reviewed that report as a staff team, at that time I was the Chief Operating Officer with the new Executive Director of the Bar, that the vast majority of those recommendations had, one, not been implemented, and two, have been repeated in successive iterations of audits that the State Bar had had by the California State Auditor. So there had been many years, I think, of frustration with the State Bar, a sense that things needed to change, and yet the Bar was resistant to change. And then, of course, this all came crashing to a head under the leadership of former Executive Director Joe Dunn, and there were lots of concerns about financial mismanagement of the organization in particular. But because of that sort of crisis that happened, the organization came under an increasing amount of scrutiny. And there began to be, on the part of the Board of Trustees, I think, finally a willingness to heed the call to change. One of the first things that they did is bring in 3 people to turn around the organization. When we were hired, myself as the Chief Operating Officer, Elizabeth Parker as the Executive Director, and Vanessa Holton as the General Counsel, the board gave us a very clear mandate to ensure that never again would we be an organization that had said we were going to make changes, said we were going to implement reports and recommendations, but didn't do so. That was our charge, to change the narrative about the state bar into one of an organization that is run well, run efficiently, and says what it means and means what it does. So that's the overall context. Then along at the same time as we were brought into the organization, again under a reform mandate, the legislature began to focus very seriously on our organization as both a trade association and a regulatory body. And there was a sense that perhaps the reason for many years of mismanagement in the organization was the fact that we were this hybrid association, both a trade association, looking out for the interests of our members, and a regulatory body. So of course, as you all are aware, I believe in January of this year, because of legislative action, the trade association part of the bar split off from the bar, and we now have the California Lawyers Association. The Board of Trustees, however, recognized that separation of the sections was likely not enough to make the transition of our organization into an appropriately regulatory body. So, pursuant to reviews of the Governance in the Public Interest Task Force, yet another statutorily mandated body charged with doing reviews of the operations and organization of the state bar, we as a group of staff were charged with looking at other vestiges of our associational structure beyond the sections. And specifically in the 2017 report of the Governance in the Public Interest Task Force, we were asked to look at our committee structure. Now together we call these our sub-entities because we have committees like the Committee of Bar Examiners, we have councils like the Council on Access and Fairness, we have commissions like the Commission on Access to Justice, we have boards like the Board of Legal Specialization. So together we call these our sub-entities. The board asked staff to look carefully at our sub-entity structure. The question was, does the use of volunteers in the way that we are using volunteers make sense given that we are a purely regulatory agency? Of course, when you think about membership bodies, the ABA being the obvious one, you have lots and lots of volunteers. It's a way to involve your members. When you're a regulatory body, the question is it appropriate and do you need to use volunteers in the same way? So we were asked to take a look at our sub-entity structure overall. In undertaking that review, there were 6 kind of components that we were tasked with looking at across all of the sub-entities. So is there a clearly defined role for the sub-entity? Are the structures set up for accountability and transparency? Clear lines of authority, that really referring to the relationship between the sub-entity and the board. Impartial, fair, and consistent decision making, very important where you have sub-entities making decisions like the Committee of Bar Examiners with respect to law school accreditation, with respect to moral character. Are we engaging in that decision making process in an impartial and fair manner and in a manner that is accountable and transparent? Engagement, a key issue. How engaged is the board with the work of the sub-entity, and is the sub-entity with the work that it's doing? And the size. This is kind of an administrative one, but an important one. We have some sub-entities that are quite large, and the board asked us to take a look at that. So we began to look at all of our sub-entities. Much of this work was done in-house, but for certain sub-entities, we contracted out portions of the review because of the significance of the study that needed to be done. One of those was the Committee of Bar Examiners. Another was our Lawyer Assistance Program. So I provide this context for you to really understand that we were looking at a vast number of sub-entities, and we handled this review process in different ways, some internally and some with the assistance of consultants. Part of the work of the Committee of Bar Examiners, of that review, entailed looking at the specific functions that were overseen by that committee. And So then we get to law school accreditation, law school engagement. But there are many other aspects of the work of the Committee of Bar Examiners that, of course, we're not talking about here today. Those, including the moral character process, exam development and grading, how we handle things like someone who's caught cheating at the exam. Those issues were all studied as part of the sub-entity review, and the board took action at its last meeting regarding a host of recommendations related to those aspects of the Committee of Bar Examiners' work. In addition, the board took action with respect to a number of recommendations regarding all other sub-entities under review. But there continue to be aspects of some sub-entities and entire sub-entities themselves that the board said, you know, we need more information before we're going to be able to make an informed decision. So for example, the Commission on Access to Justice and the Legal Services Trust Fund Commission, the board did not take any action on those in September, directed staff to do more work and come back at a later date with recommendations addressing a number of concerns that the board has with respect to potential recommendations in those areas. And with respect to the Committee of Bar Examiners, the board did not take action regarding law school accreditation and law school engagement. The thought being that we need to have a more informed and involved discussion with the law schools most directly impacted by those recommendations before we can bring forth anything that we ask the board to act upon. And so that's the genesis for the meetings that we have held this week, one in San Francisco and this one here today. Of course, we had prepared for the board recommendations in both of these areas, and I think the recommendations, as you all understood them, did cause some alarm. Since the time that we have drafted those, between that time and the meeting that we held on Tuesday, we made some modifications to our recommendations. So we're going to present those to you here today. Those recommendations perhaps will be modified even further, or are likely to, based on the feedback that we're getting at these meetings. So for example, we will share with you the results of the meeting on Tuesday, I think, which were a little different than we expected, so that you can all get a sense of what your Northern California counterparts thought as we work together to come up with a recommendation that will go to the board. Depending on timing, depending on readiness, actually, the recommendation will go to the board for its November meeting, or it will go to the board at its January meeting, just to give folks a sense of the timeline here. We have that latitude and some flexibility in terms of when we bring recommendations back to the board. So I'm sure, once again, I have completely blown how I was supposed to do this introduction. I'm going to turn things over to Donna. Before I do that, just say, I hope that the context is helpful. I think sometimes there is a sense, one, of randomness. Why is the State Bar looking at this? If it's not broken, don't fix it. There's a sense that some have expressed to me that there's sort of a feeling of being picked on. I really hope that you all understand that this process is years in the making. Certainly, we understand our charge as an organization to operate effectively, to operate transparently, and to operate in accordance with best practice. And that's really where we're coming from as we explore all of these issues. So thank you for coming. I look forward to an engaged conversation. And with that, I will turn it over to Donna.
Great. Thank you. The plan for today is start with a discussion of law school engagement. And then in the afternoon, assuming it takes us through that point, we will turn to accreditation. We structured the meeting that way on Tuesday as well as today because we know the issues of accreditation are more relevant to the CALS deans and the deans of the registered law schools, and so we wanted to sort of make a logical break for the deans of the ABA schools to go on and do other things on their agenda if they so choose. Starting with law school engagement, I just wanted to very quickly, you all probably know better than I, sort of go over the sort of the way that the State Bar and the CBE engage with law schools and law school deans currently. Then we wanted to have a little bit of a values discussion. So, because there are a couple of issues that we certainly want to reinforce about what we're trying to do here, and what we're not trying to do. And then we will, I'm going to sort of skip through some of the slides a little bit based on the way the conversation went on Tuesday, and highlight what the staff proposal was, and then how the discussion went on Tuesday, and then we can start together figuring out what we think makes sense. So, current methods of law school, of engagement with the law schools right now. We have the law school council, which includes 3 members from the Committee of Bar Examiners, 10 law school deans, broken out, as you see, as 6 ABA deans, 2 CALs and 2 registered law school deans, and a member of the Board of Trustees. These are the official 14 members of the commission. We have RAC, the Advisory Committee on California Accredited Law Schools, which is comprised of 3 CDE members and 3 law school deans that are selected by the CALS deans. And currently the breakout is 2 CALS deans and 1 registered dean are the law school dean representatives on RAC. We also have the Law School Assembly, which is an opportunity for us to meet with all of the deans. We do that once a year, and present information that we think might be useful and helpful to the deans. Whether or not it's proven to be useful and helpful is part of the purpose of today's discussion. And then also we meet annually with the registrars. We've got those meetings coming up in the next couple of weeks. So what is it that we're trying to achieve here with the proposals that we're about to talk about? One of the things that's, I think, critically important to understand is that this is not an attempt to reduce the opportunities to engage with the law schools and get the input from the law schools on issues of import to the law schools. And issues of import to the law students. This is actually an attempt to increase the opportunities for meaningful participation and engagement. And that is what we are seeking to do. This is not about money. There's been, as we've met with a lot of the committees as we talk through the reviews that we're doing, we always hear people say, I know what you're trying to do is reduce costs, and so you reduce some of the times that we meet. It's not about cost. It really is going back to what Leah was talking about, sort of trying to figure out an effective way to manage the work we do, an effective way to do this important work. We want to provide opportunities as part of the engagement with law schools for representatives from all categories of law schools. Everyone has input on different areas, and we want to make sure that we have meaningful opportunities for input and discussion and brainstorming with all of the categories of law schools. We want to provide you more frequent updates. We've started to think about some of the ways that we have provided you updates at the Law School Assembly, Law School Council meetings, and I don't think it's the most effective. I don't think we've given you the most effective information to make them valuable uses of your time, and I think we can do a lot better on that. And we also want to make sure that the interests of the public remain at the forefront. Public protection is is the primary mission of the State Bar, and so the protection of public and consumer interests have to remain at the forefront of the decisions we make and the actions we take. So, what is it that staff have proposed? And this was set forth, I think I sent everybody, in one of the emails, I had sent a link, I think, to the report that was presented to the Board of Trustees in September. And in that report, it included a list of where we may be going, what we're currently thinking about law school engagement as well as accreditation. And this is consistent, our current proposal is consistent with what we laid out there. I'm going to talk about all of the areas in which we currently have engagement and how we're proposing to change those. So first, we have, as we talked about, we have RAC, which is focused on guidelines for accreditation, California accredited law schools. What we are proposing is, in lieu of RAC, to convene ad hoc working groups on discrete issues as those issues arise. And so one of the ways that this would be different than RAC is there may be a working group that we would need to convene on moral character issues. One of the things that we know that we want to do is create clearer guidelines, potentially decision matrices, definitely clearer guidelines on how the moral character decision-making process works. It's important for us, it's important for you as deans, obviously, to have that information and to be able to inform your students of that. We see that we envision putting together a working group that wouldn't be limited to Cal's deans. It would be, we would have deans from, potentially deans from all of the categories of law schools, representatives from CBE, potentially representatives from other states to see how they do moral character. So that would be an ad hoc working group that we would develop. We know we need to do a review, and we'll talk more about this afternoon, of our accreditation guidelines. That would be we envision a working group there. We wouldn't envision having ABA deans on that working group. But we see that there are going to be needs for working groups on discrete topics. How do we handle testing accommodation? Some topics will necessarily be of interest to all of the categories of law schools, and we will want input from all of the categories of law schools. Some topics will be of interest to only one or two, and so that's where we would limit the membership of those working groups. The working groups would vary in duration, in participant type, and in size based on the topic of the that we are studying with the working group at that time. We envision that these working groups would be convened on the recommendation or request of staff, Board of Trustees, the Committee of Bar Examiners, and sort of, as we had drafted it here in this proposal, the Law School Council, and we'll get to sort of why I'm phrasing it that way. But the idea being that the deans may very well identify areas that require study, input, new rules, new processes, and we want to make sure that there's a forum, a venue for the deans to say, we need to study this as well, and so that can be elevated, so there can be a working group based on the input of what the deans are recommending. So those would be the ad hoc working groups, and in addition to that, what we had initially proposed is that we would continue the Law School Council. The Law School Council would continue to be comprised of members from all of the categories of law schools. The Law School Council, so the ABA deans on the Law School Council, if we had an ad hoc, if we said we want to do an ad hoc working group on moral character, the ABA deans would solicit ABA deans or associate deans or whomever is appropriate for participation. The CALS deans would solicit the CALS deans or associate deans for participation, et cetera, et cetera. And so the Law School Council could be sort of that venue to provide us the members of the ad hoc working group, and also the venue for the law schools to come to when they think that there is something that needs to be studied. And then we would continue with convening the Law School Assembly. We would continue with the annual registrar's meetings, and we would also propose to do some periodic e-newsletters to maintain more frequent communication. So what happened on Tuesday? So on Tuesday we spent a long time going through this, and ultimately at the end of nearly 2 hours, I think, of discussion, there was a lot of discussion of the value of the Law School Council, and some of that certainly goes to what issues have been put on the agenda. Law School Council meets generally 2 times a year. And ultimately, what we've got from the room was a feeling that the Law School Council, in and of itself, has not proven valuable for the deans. that they don't need a venue like the Law School Council as a way to identify members of the working group, that, we can, I've got a working group that requires input from, participation from all types of deans. I would send an email to all of the ABA deans, let them know, and they would get together, either, a couple of people would volunteer, or they would nominate somebody and send a similar email to the registrars, et cetera, et cetera. And what we talked about was the value really can come in the law school assembly. And what we had talked about was doing 2 meetings of the law school assembly every year, and really not sort of walking you through our Office of Admissions process, not walking you through sort of how we do everything, which is one of the things that we did this year. We thought it was very informative to walk you through all of the various things we do, but there are a lot of meaty issues out there that we have in common. And that really was sort of the question of, the Law School Council, several of the ABA deans who were present were commenting that they don't have that much in common with the CALS deans and the registered deans. But there are a lot of commonalities, and we don't dig into those issues. We talked about wellness programs. We talked about, what were some of the other meaty issues that we talked about that as a group we could...
You say the moral character process.
Moral character process, the bar passage rate.
The job analysis study that we're undertaking now. ADA accommodations.
So these were issues where we thought we could have sort of real discussions with all of the deans, and potentially that we would even develop ad hoc working groups as a result of some of those discussions. But that there were some big issues and meaty issues that everyone had in common, and that bringing everybody together and starting the discussions on those meaty issues would be valuable, and that would be a good way to use the law school assembly, and as I said, sort of increase the frequency of those meetings from 1 time a year to 2 times a year, and then eliminate the law school council, because it would no longer be needed for that purpose. When it comes to I still wanted to talk about what I did with the ad hoc working groups in place of RAC. When it comes to the issue of RAC and its work on guidelines for accredited schools, I'd like to put that part of the discussion over to the afternoon when we talk about the accredited schools, the accreditation process. But I think that the concept of the ad hoc working groups is relevant because that's providing a venue that I don't think really exists right now, where we are sort of pulling folks from all of the categories of law schools as appropriate to really help us dig in on rule changes, guideline changes, development of policies on a variety of issues that affect the law schools. So I think at this point, I'd be interested in your thoughts and feedback.
One question. Has there been any talk about how it would be determined when an ad hoc group ends?
So I think the answer is it depends. In all likelihood, when we would create an ad hoc group, we would create it with an expectation that this group would end in 18 months. This group would end in 12 months. But the goal being, certain rules are created and presented to the Board of Trustees for adoption. And so, we're doing that right now with our job analysis working group and our working group on access through innovation in legal services, where we're creating a term for the working group. And should the work end up somehow not being completed by the end of the term, then we will request an extension of the term, as we did with the Rules Revision Commission.
Hi, Party Critic, Concord. So, I frankly don't have that strong feelings about the Law School Assembly versus the Law School Council. I think it makes sense to me what you're saying in terms of ad hoc working groups, maybe in lieu of a standing Law School Council. I don't think I understand yet why ad hoc working groups have been proposed in lieu of the RAC. You know, for what it's worth, in the 2.5 years I've been in this role, I've been to a variety of meetings. RAC, to me, has always been consistently one of the most productive that's actually addressing substantive issues. I think it's benefited from having that consistency of, you know, people who work on those issues for a while. I know they worked on the proposed revisions. I know you want to set that aside for the afternoon, but I think it's relevant to how it relates to these other working group issues. And it's taken, you know, a sustained effort over the course of years to make some of that progress, and I think has really benefited from that structure. So, you know, I know we can talk about some of those related issues more in the afternoon, but at this point, I don't understand. I understand a lot of what has been said in terms of the impetus for some of the looking at these things and trying to streamline things, but the RAC is the piece of it that I haven't seen yet.
I'd like to add to that too. I don't understand why you can't have both. Why can't you have RAC and ad hoc? Because one thing that concerns me is who is going to be selecting these people that are going to be on the ad hoc? Who makes the decision that we need an ad hoc working group? Is that going to be just staff?
No. And that's why we had struggled, and initially the impetus for our recommendation to continue the council was because of this issue of us believing that it's not appropriate for the bar to select who's going to be on the ad hoc working group to represent a school. And that there needs to be two-way communication, or the two-way ability to indicate that there's a need for a working group. And so it's a little difficult to see how that happens without some organizing structure. The council being potentially an organizing structure that could, one, alert the bar, hey, we need a working group on this topic. And when a working group is going to be established, to use the council as the vehicle for identifying members for the working group from the law school community. That was the impetus for our recommendation. The meeting on Tuesday, there was a lot of conversation about whether that was necessary, if through the assembly process, the need for a working group could come up through individual dean communication. There was, the most vocal, I think, advocate of this was an ABA dean. And really one of our issues is the ABA schools have been really disengaged from all of these processes. And so his view was, we'll organize ourselves. If there's a urgent need to do something, we'll let you know. Like with Bar Pass, this happens organically. We can organize ourselves. We don't need to have a law school council in order to let you know that we need a working group. So that was just part of the conversation that came up on Tuesday.
Actually, this question that you've raised was one of the things that I really wanted to focus on, because I think whether it's the law school assembly or something else, there needs to be a mechanism to protect the staff from feelings that the staff has somehow manipulated who's on a particular working group. And so whatever the mechanism is, I particularly feel after a very long total period of years looking at the bar exam issues in particular, that we have an opportunity now, because this newer generation of leadership has been willing to open up a lot of issues and to try to work meaningful change and to be responsive. But I think if you're just collecting recommendations from deans, I'm not sure that people will be particularly responsive, and then you're going to be faced with, how am I going to choose among these? And I honestly think we all have an interest in protecting this staff in this moment where you're trying to confront things in ways that are unprecedented, going back many decades, and where I think the working groups are potentially extremely valuable. And I want to use an example. There was a working group convened to discuss the data collection from the ABA schools, and I agreed to be on it on the condition that I could bring the person at our school who I thought would know the most about what we ought to be looking at. And I think without her, we wouldn't have had the same look at what kinds of questions were we going to ask the participating schools in the study to respond to. And I think there are all kinds of things like that, where at least in the ABA world, the dean is not the best person to have in that working group. So we need to have a process that helps us figure out, whatever school the person is in, who are the best people to be on this working group to drive forward a fresh look that will likely produce some change in a given area. And I'm really pleased to hear you talk about accommodation, because I think accommodation issues are massive and so important in terms of fundamental fairness. And there's tremendous prejudice in the world about accommodation. There's prejudice in our student bodies about it. And we really have to, in serving fundamental fairness, grapple with those issues.
I would just say one of the recommendations that came out from Tuesday in terms of the first part of your response, Dean Prager. Dean Prager was my dean, and so she keeps telling me to call her by her first name, but it's really difficult for me. She's my dean.
Once you graduate, you're supposed to call me by her first name.
One of the conversations was, okay, so if we want to create a working group, how do we go about getting the names? Because again, we don't want to be selecting the names. And so using the ABAs as an example, the theory was, okay, we're going to have a working group. I'd send out an email to all of the ABA deans saying, here's the working group, here's the charge. We're looking for, a group that is a total of 15 people. We're looking for 3 ABA deans. And then to the extent that I received self-nominations, if you will, from more than 3 ABA deans, I would send it back out to the ABA dean saying, okay, we've got 5, which of the 3 do you want? So at no point would I be making the call. To the extent that I got 1, I would go back out again to the ABA deans and say, I need 2 more. But yeah, the idea would be to create a system where staff isn't selecting the members. And you're right, there are certain things where it just makes it may make more sense to have your assistant dean, your someone in on the academic side. So there could be a mix of people depending on the subject area, and we're certainly open to that. Go ahead. I think George, you had your hand up first.
Yeah, let me ask a question and also make an observation. The first question is we've heard a lot about proposals and recommendations from staff, but I don't know if I haven't heard, what you consider law school engagement, and what would you do or moving forward with that engagement? Because I think if we had a better understanding of what you expect the law schools to provide in terms of engagement, it helps us frame what we think are reasonable alternatives or further support some of the existing structures. My observation when it comes to the discussion of the Law School Council Assembly and Iraq, again, look at the history and look at the reality. Is if the Law School Council is poorly attended, primarily made up of ABA deans, because it has very little relevance to their world. They are very engaged with the ABA because the ABA is their accreditor and the regulator. When it comes to the State Bar of California, you get the attention of the ABA deans, as we saw a year or so ago, when what? You talk about the bar exam, you talk to the cut score. That's why the Law School Council came into existence years ago. That gets their attention, that gets their engagement for all the right reasons. When you talk about the RAC, what I keep hearing is a fundamental misunderstanding, intentional or not, of what the RAC does. The CALs and how schools like mine, who hope someday to be accredited, are, I believe, incredibly engaged in the process. You see the deans coming to these meetings from all over the state. And so what I would say when we get to discussion of RAC is with law school council, ad hoc working groups make some sense because by law you have to give the schools 2 years notice if you're going to change the content of the bar exam. You can set up an ad hoc working group to talk about that or the cut score because you've got long-term goals in mind and a long-term perspective. You probably already know this. Setting up working groups internally as staff is very time consuming. It's very inefficient. You're constantly trying to get people to volunteer, and those volunteers are busy. I've only been a dean 6 weeks, but now I have a very different perspective of how busy your average law school dean is. And I have a very small school to administer. So getting working groups and ad hoc committees together, it takes a lot of staff time, is inefficient, and doesn't really solve more pressing problems. It would work in the law school council for big issues, law school, bar exam content, cut score, other matters that apply equally to all the schools. So moving forward, as we discuss the RAC, is getting to law school engagement, just respect the reality and history. The RAC's been in existence for 10 years. It's been exceptionally effective for many different reasons. Go back and read 10 years of minutes. You're sitting in Natalie's office, you can do that. You'll see what the RAC has been doing for 10, 40 years. So working groups to replace what the RAC does, and what you could do further, I have ideas I'll say this afternoon, to enhance, improve, and make law school engagement more effective, I think is the way to go. But again, I'd like to hear what staff thinks kind of engagement should exist at the law school council level and later on this afternoon regarding the RAC.
Yeah. So I can't speak to the RAC, but it's clear that many of you think it's valuable and working. But my fear is that without the working groups on the other issues, we're not going to be able to
You don't have to fear that.
evaluate.
They'll exist. They'll exist. No need to fear it.
I'm not fearing it. I'm just trying to say I can't speak to that, but I can speak to the fact that I strongly believe that there are very important issues, most of them relating to the bar exam, but not all of them, that need attention. And I think without the working groups, it's not going to happen.
Susan,
Susan,
you're right. And there will be working groups. I think Leah and Donna are proponents of working groups.
But just in terms of, I'm sorry, I'm talking so much, but as the only ABA person here.
Which is very indicative, by the way.
Yes, it is.
So just to respond to George's question, that when we talk about engagement, the composition of this meeting, the composition of the meeting on Tuesday, is precisely indicative of one of the engagement problems that we have. We do believe that APA deans should find a reason to be more engaged, because although we are not their accreditor, there are many issues that we are tackling that are very, very relevant to that group. So the fact that we haven't figured out a way to effectively engage them is a reflection of a problem with the status quo. So that is one component of engagement. The other is that we meaningfully engage schools on the important issues that we're tackling, all schools. So for example, when we make decisions about how to, I'm going to pick testing accommodations, there are a lot of issues there with respect to how we do or do not recognize or handle accommodations that a student was given in law school. There are many ways that we could approach innovating in this area, streamlining, creating efficiencies, and somehow some economies of scale and working together on this issue. I think the way that we have been structured and done our work historically, this is not an area that we would have proactively reached out to the law schools to talk about. But I think that that's the wrong approach. The moral character process, the recommendations that the board did approve in September suggested a wholesale revision to our process. This is an area I think all law schools should be very interested in, and that the law schools should be engaged with us in giving input regarding how we might make changes to our process, not decision-making authority, but input. So that's what engagement looks like. It looks like meaningful engagement of both ABA deans and non-ABA deans. It means meaningful engagement on important issues, period. And it also means a group of deans that feel like they have information about what the state bar is doing. That you don't have to hunt around on our website and look for minutes of meetings to figure out what the Office of Admissions is doing, but that there is some effort to proactively communicate as a group of our stakeholders. So that hence the idea of an e-newsletter. We do a legislative newsletter to members of the legislature every quarter. That's an important group of stakeholders. We do reports to the Supreme Court, another stakeholder. These are more of our oversight bodies. But again, stakeholders, I would argue that all of you are our stakeholders. So there is a reason to do proactive communication outward. So that's what engagement looks like.
Hi Leah, I'm Darren. Hi Donna, I'm Darren. I've been at Glendale for 22 years and arguably involved for longer, as my father founded Glendale in 1967, same year I was born. So I've had decades of intimate connection. I am greatly appreciative for your opening remarks in acknowledging decades of deficiencies in the function of the Committee of Bar Examiners and the governing entity. Many of us, I have been aware of inadequate decision-making processes, inadequate disclosures, behind-the-scenes manipulations, and a new commitment to transparency is much welcome. At the same time, when there is a conflation of the ABA and the Cal-accredited schools and unaccredited registered schools, I agree with Susan. The working groups on ADA issues, job-related issues, we will all benefit from that. The issue I've got is an existing meaningful structure directly related to accreditation, which the ABA schools don't. And I'm looking at the clock, it's like almost 11, and I know we're trying to push something off until the afternoon. I don't think anyone here challenges Susan's observations about working groups. We support it. But the rest of us who are here, that's not our primary issue. And I have trust issues. I'm public about them. And one of the reasons I appreciated your candor in your opening remarks was your opening remarks established the basis for why I've got trust issues with the Committee of Bar Examiners. And if the Committee of Bar Examiners and the board and trustees, whomever else, did not manage those issues very well for decades and disregarded recommendations that the structure itself wanted to implement, how all of a sudden, with a cleaning of the house, with there being really no wisdom left regarding the accreditation, the special, unique, and what should be celebrated accreditation of this unique collection of law schools in California, why should I trust you? And honestly, your answer to George was not a good answer. And buried in your answer was an observation that said, oh, it's not going to be about decision making. You're not going to be vested in the process. We're going to listen to you and we want to talk to you, but you're really not going to be vested in the process. And when I hear outsourcing of accreditation function, when there is a wonderful history of an accreditation function being largely successful, and you're now telling me that there's not an issue with money, which means you can sustain it, I have reason not to trust you. And again, the response to George wasn't a good response. It was kind of political and plain, and it referenced ABA. There's one ABA dean here, and I think you should engage the ABA schools more. I think that bars should do more with engaging law schools. But honestly, this group is assembled, with the exception of one ABA dean, and we basically will support what she says for an issue where your organization, which you're somewhat new to, is saying to a wonderful, complex existing structure, we're thinking about outsourcing it. And then you're going after, as my colleagues have articulated, the RAC, which its value is phenomenal. And if you don't think it is, I would take George up on his recommendation to read minutes.
Okay, so I just want to respond to what other people talk and to say that I am glad that there's perhaps consensus around the working group topic. I think we do need to have some discussion about how the members of the working groups will be selected. Again, there is a question of, do you need a council simply to do that, or is there another way? With respect to accreditation, that is the afternoon discussion. We do have a slightly modified staff recommendation with respect to the outsourcing issue. What I would say about decision-making authority, this is an important point. We have had some challenges to our status quo structure presented based on the idea that the regulated community, which is the accredited and registered law schools, have decision-making power over their regulation. That is something that is not appropriate. We've had legal challenges, and we've had challenges from more of a perception perspective. So it is important that there is input, but there is not decision-making by the law schools
I think
about
that's a
the regulation.
mischaracterization of the role of RAC.
I'm explaining my statement that I made.
Yes,
that
keep
it
in
is
mind
important.
what you represent.
Okay, so I think it's important for all of you to understand that we are asked to respond to those legal challenges presented to us, but we're also asked to respond to political challenges based on perception that are presented to us. And issues have been raised with us regarding the RAC. I believe,
correct the perception.
well, I believe that there are other ways to ensure participation by accredited and registered law schools in the development and implementation of standards and policies, aside from a standing committee of the Committee of Bar Examiners. It's okay to have a disagreement regarding what the appropriate vehicle is for schools to provide input. There is a common understanding or agreement, consensus around the idea that schools need to be able to provide input. The point of contention is, what is the structure for that input? Is it a standing subcommittee of the Committee of Bar Examiners? Or is it through working groups established to address particular issues like modifications to rules and guidelines? So that is just a different perspective.
That's what George asked. And candidly, I'm waiting for an answer. I'm waiting for insights, I'm waiting for some explanation. And what seems to be missing, and the legal challenge to RAC was profoundly weak, and it was based in tremendous misunderstandings. I don't accept that as any kind of meaningful or legitimate basis for what was articulated. And when you combine outsourcing accreditation, contemplation of requiring WASC, elimination of RAC, which we are not understanding. We don't understand why, as one of my colleagues said, why does it need to be eliminated? Why can't it become part? And so there's this destruction, which is easy to do, and it's very difficult to build, Leah. And my observation to you is I'm seeing not thoughtful destruction and an absence of wisdom in what's being exercised from your team and from the powers that be. When a question such as George framed is not, you're not able to answer it with any kind of depth.
Well, I think I did answer it, and I think some other people here want to speak, so I want to make sure.
Did she answer it? I'd love to hear some other people speak, because I think it was superficial and two-dimensional. And you're talking about the potential challenging the existence to an institution like Glendale that's celebrating its 52nd anniversary.
Okay. Do you first want to speak?
So Jay Fricker, UWLA, had more of a definitional question, and by way of background why I wanted about the definition. For the last 5 years I've been dean for UWLA. I'm an alum of a Cal school. In the last 5 years I have hosted or I've participated as a team member on 6 accreditation visits, 3 or 4 for the bar examiners, 3 for WASC. And to me, things are always definitional when you get down to the end of it. For WASC, it seems to be the word assessment. For our discussion that I'm hearing, it seems to be consumer protection. So I was wondering if I could have a definition of who is the consumer? Is that the public? Is that the students, the law schools, the examinees? And what are we trying to protect them from? Are we trying to protect them from illegal activity, malpractice, predatory admission, retention? I think that would help me better understand the process.
So when we're talking consumer protection, we're in large part talking about accreditation, and we'll get to that as soon as this conversation concludes on engagement. And you'll see that's part of what we listed in the values discussion on accreditation. And there we are talking in large part about sort of the students. You can certainly extend it to the people who sort of the general public who might be a client of the student, but we're really looking at the student, the consumer protection issue for the student on that point. Yeah, I mean, I think we have no need to have the accreditation discussion in the afternoon. The point is to conclude this discussion, and then we'll be able to move on to the RAC discussion and the accreditation.
Well, in that spirit, I would like to make a comment about the Northern Californians' approach of resting on the assembly to serve this role of advising about the working groups. The assembly is so large that I'm really kind of surprised that people thought that was the right vehicle. And I'm looking at Mitch because
There's one. You had one colleague there, so
that makes me feel better. There was
so
only
we
one in
worked
Northern
with-
California.
and we worked with
There
Steve,
were
so.
There were two.
But we didn't hear an opinion from the associate dean at Santa Clara that I remember, because he's never been to any of those. He's very new.
And the other point I want to make, because I don't want to impede you all's desire to have this other discussion, but the other point is, I think one of the reasons that ABA deans don't participate in some things is that the groups are very large, and they are, because there are so many of you and relatively few of us in the ABA, they're just not as workable. And through Mitch's leadership, I think we have had a somewhat different era in the Law School Council, and that's very much something that
Susan, that's been my observation as well, as limited as it is. I think you hit on it earlier when in the past, and I'm fairly new, but in the past it appears that Law School Council and Law School Assembly, to the extent that the ABA deans participated or didn't, was because it was specifically required of ABA deans. And they were elected deans to participate, and there were only a few on the council at any rate. And they were utterly precluded from sending someone else in their stead, who, to your point earlier, would have been a more appropriate selection. And I recall Mitch, in that first Law School Council meeting that was convened under your leadership, there was unanimous consent to alter that requirement, to change that in an effort to get more participation from the ADA. Sorry. And the other thing I would add with respect to that, lifting that requirement and giving you the latitude to send the most appropriate person, I think also gives the thing we're not talking about that the RAC provides, and that's collegiality. Again, I'm new a couple of years, and RAC offered me an opportunity to meet face-to-face my colleagues and develop collegial relationships under which I felt comfortable picking up the phone and saying, hey, you know, I could use some advice about how do you guys do this, you know, and I appreciated that collegiality. It also gave us the opportunity to understand, for the purpose of a working group, who would be a good person to sit on that group. I couldn't make a recommendation out of whole cloth from my office in Long Beach if somebody were to ask me, say we need somebody to do this on this working group. If I don't have a sense of who the players are and what their skill sets are and the kind of expertise and culture they bring to the table, I can't make an appropriate recommendation to the bar for someone I think would be useful and make meaningful contributions. I'm not going to volunteer if I don't think I have that contribution. But it's the collegiality of the RAC and the collegiality of the Law School Council that I was looking forward to under this new understanding that I would have an opportunity to meet my ABA colleagues and counterparts, which going to other events I've made an opportunity to do. You know, I've gone and visited UCI and said, can I meet your Dean of Academic Standards? Can I, you know, to create them on my own because that vehicle wasn't available to me. So I think aside from the actual work that the RAC performed over these last 10 years, for my own experience, it's been the collegiality that has been the benefit, creating that deeper understanding of my role in this universe, and not feeling so, you know, just isolated in the work that we do as law schools.
To Jackie Gardino, Santa Barbara Ventura Colleges of Law, just to focus specifically on the Law School Council. I absolutely agree with the benefit of working groups. I think that is a good and necessary part of how we can move forward productively on issues that affect all of our students and all of new attorneys. So I wholeheartedly support that. Having a diversity of voices and a diversity of expertise on those working groups is only going to benefit the outcome. What I think, or make a recommendation, because I think there is some disagreement or ambivalence about what to do with the Law School Council, I think it can still act as a good filter. I think Susan brought up a really good point about protecting the bar staff. And you know, you put up at the beginning that focus on accountability and transparency, impartial, fair, and consistent decision-making, and engagement. So adding the ad hoc working groups is going to be a big plus. Using the Law School Council as a filter for the working group's recommendations to bring it to a group and say, here is what the working group came up with, we'd like the Law School Council's feedback, could act as that additional filter or additional buffer between the ad hoc working group's decision and the ultimate staff or board of trustees decision, because you're just adding a greater diversity of voices. It will be the deans, if we assume the Law School Council maintains the dean requirement, who will be providing direct feedback of, wow, what a great solution the working group came up with, or here are some issues I see with what the working group came up with, and provide additional insights and recommendations. So you don't have to deconstruct the current system, but you can use it differently and more effectively.
One of the discussions was also about timing. And so the working groups may form throughout the course of a year. And so one of the things that we certainly want to be able to do if we use the Law School Council as sort of that filter is not have to wait for standing meetings in order to send out the request for representatives for the working group, And, so we need to sort of figure out sort of what kind of standing meetings we would have of the law school council and what sort of the function of those standing meetings would be, a venue for the law schools to bring issues. Obviously, you want them to make sure if there is a need that they are aware of that we are not, we wouldn't want to wait, for January and July for those either, right? So we need to sort of make sure that there's a process so you're not sort of relying on standing committee schedules in order to have that discussion.
And it seems like a structure issue and a process issue, not necessarily we need to destroy what currently exists, we just need to operate it differently than it's currently operated in order to meet the needs.
Well, and like we said, the original staff proposal that we brought on Tuesday was that we would maintain the law school council for this purpose. The discussion on Tuesday sort of led in the direction of we don't need the law school council for that purpose. We can get rid of it. You increase the law school assembly meetings. We have some real meaty discussions which really would bring people from all areas. So that's why we wanted to sort of present sort of what the original proposal was and sort of the direction from yesterday. We're going to have to take the input from both groups and develop a proposal on that.
George? If I could just echo Dean Gardina, I agree with her wholeheartedly. I want just to clarify my comments that I think at the law school council level, working groups make a lot of sense. And my suggestion is, and I think the problem with the council going back years is it didn't really have any clear focus. If you gave the council in an annual basis something to do, here's an issue, we want engagement from the schools, and the classic one, and this is, again, goes back, is the idea that we've been testing minimum competence of a generation of California attorneys, and we've never, the state bar has never defined that. Now, I would think it would be perhaps an excellent example of giving that task and assignment to the council. They form a working group. The working group does their thing. They come back, they discuss it at the assembly, and then they can make a meaningful, fully vetted recommendation that we hope the board of trustees would eventually adopt. But I think the problem historically has been the council, would send out an agenda and there was not much to talk about. Again, you could see, the lightning struck when the cut score issue blew up and all that. And if looking forward, there's going to be changes to content. I mean, that seems to me the most logical and ultimately effective use of the council and the assembly, and the real hard work would be done by the working group. My earlier comment was, to divorce it from the way the WAC operates, and we'll save that those further comments this afternoon. The last thing I'd like to say is I hope I listened to every word of the committee bar examiners last meeting, and before we go too much further, I want to endorse what the committee did, which is I think the newsletter, having the schools informed, I think that's an excellent idea. And in addition to the other forms of engagement that we ultimately are left with or are given, I think all the deans would like to see or read what staff's thinking or what's going on at the board level. So I hope that doesn't get lost in the shuffle. It's not a zero-sum game there. But e-newsletter, I think, would be a wonderful addition to both improve communication and have a mechanism to be able to come up with ideas. And the council needs probably to decide or get engaged in other aspects, and that newsletter would help them. So on that, and then the last thing, again, plug for the committee, I hope the board eventually listens to the votes of the committee, I would say, with regard to all these issues, because they spoke unanimously and very forcefully. So that's just my soapbox speech with regard to that point.
I aspire in People's College Law. There's something that was said, things that were said about accreditation of opinions that I know it's reactive. I can't let this pass for now. Donna, no offense, but there was a question asked: who is to be protected with regard to accreditation? And your answer was the students. And I'm sorry, but I was rather shocked that that is the only thing that was mentioned. It's also the consumers of legal services. In other words, the issue is access to justice. And we have this accreditation system that is by far the best in the nation, that allows all these schools to improve access to justice. And that protection, there's at least two constituencies that need to be protected.
So if you wait when we get to the values discussion for accreditation, this, our slide specifically talks about access issues as well. Go ahead.
Okay. So
I think she wanted to say,
Yeah, go ahead.
Marnie Carmona, Central Coast University. I find it most frustrating that what I'm hearing here is if this is about engagement, and we have practically 100% engagement on a discrete set of ideas that the RAC represents. And rather than using all of that knowledge and its history, it just wants to be discarded. We should be considered, and our efforts along the way should be used rather than walked away from. Because if you want to replicate it, why are you not taking any of our input into consideration with your reconstruction of some entity that will probably not be as engaged as all of us are?
Well, and I just want to say, I don't understand what the reason is of getting rid of the RAC. If you're saying it's because they are a decision-making group, they are a recommending group. They do not make decisions. So I think that your basic understanding of what the RAC is off. And I know that George can give you more of a history, or Mitch can give you more of a history of what the RAC is, because I think that your understanding of what RAC does is completely wrong.
That's not my understanding. I'm trying to say very carefully what the challenges are that have been presented to the state bar. One is a legal challenge about the existence and function of the RAC, and one is a perception-based challenge. So it is not my understanding that the RAC is making decisions. That speaks to the legal challenge that's been posed to the state bar. There are other issues that have been raised that are based on perception. And again, what I don't think is that productive, because I really understand there is unanimous desire on the part of at least all of the CalSACers and the registered schools to keep the RAC as it is. I understand that. So I understand it. I just think there are two real options: keep it as it is, or change the structure with respect to the way in which CALS and registered schools provide input into the law school accreditation process to one that is based on working groups that are established for limited duration and where the membership of those groups changes over time. They're just two different options, and that's all that it is. And I'm really clear on how strongly people feel about maintaining the status quo when it comes to the RAC.
I don't know how you could be, Leah, because you're too new to the game. And you're presenting binary. And it's not one or the other. And in light of the magnitude of what you're endeavoring to modify and shepherd, everything doesn't need to be done in one fell swoop. It just doesn't. And it sounds to me like the assembly and the council, it sounds to me like there are very clear and good proposals on the table. It also sounds to me like there's not very clear and good proposals on the table for replacing something that's actually functioning well. And again, I reject the legal challenges. And if the bar actually, it says there's legitimacy to the legal challenges, I would like that in writing, personally. But I don't think everything needs to be on the chopping block at once.
And Leah, just to be clear, and I think everyone sitting around this table understands, I mean, so with getting the RAC, and I know this is all perhaps premature, you mentioned a legal challenge potential and a political one. The legal challenge is a dead letter. If you haven't, and I know you have, read the very well-crafted opinion letter of OGC. I can't remember
it's posted on our website.
Correct. And I read it closely, and I think it was incredibly effective, because as we all know, the Supreme Court, I'll cite the Supreme Court of California, dismissed what was obviously an ill-conceived, poorly researched, and absolutely incorrect interpretation of a mashup of laws, and they summarily denied the challenge. So when you get to the legal question about whether the RAC is operating as it currently is structured lawfully, I see no further need to discuss that issue. It's a dead letter. We have a summary decision by the Supreme Court of California based upon a challenge. So now the politics behind the RAC is another matter. We'll take time this afternoon to talk about that. But I keep hearing about these legal challenges, and it just makes no sense to me. There is none. As we sit here today, that's been decided.
So I would simply suggest to you that there may be things that the communications that we receive from our various stakeholders that you may not be aware of, that make things that make us have to consider both of those issues, legal challenges and the perception issues. I'm very familiar with the OGC opinion. I'm not conceding that we view that there is anything meritorious to any legal challenge that's been presented, and there are quite a number of them. But I'm just suggesting to you that there's a lot of feedback that we get along the way from our various stakeholders that makes us have to pay attention to some of these things.
When it comes to the legal challenge, consider the source. Because as you know, having been named defendant, the State Bar on multiple occasions, every staff member and committee is always subject to frivolous lawsuits filed in a self-serving manner by a very small number of individuals. And I don't think, from a broad perspective policy issue with regard to the engagement of 60 law schools in California, that any one individual or a couple of individuals, based upon threats of frivolous legal action, should drive this discussion. And I'll just be frank, because I think if that's what you're alluding to, I'm well aware of the reality, and I don't think that it's a fair characterization of who would challenge, why there would be a legal challenge. And again, go back to OGC. The law clearly establishes that the RAC is lawfully and established by design to basically do nothing but recommend. And when you talk about regulatory capture, that's absurd. It's designed to be, in a worst-case scenario, deadlocked with 3 committee members. And maybe Dean Winnick can remind me, I think in the history in 10 years, that's happened once, I can recall, maybe twice, back when we were talking about the NPR. It does one thing, and it does one thing well. It makes very sound, well-vetted, discussed, and agreed upon recommendations to the committee that the committee then can take action on. So but when you get to the law, I think I know a little bit about the law, particularly antitrust law, and there's just nothing there. So I don't know if there are other potential legal challenges that we haven't been informed about, and maybe we should, just to clarify and provide everybody here a better understanding of what's driving staff's decision when it comes to the RAC. Because when it comes to frivolous, ill-conceived, perhaps even malicious threats of litigation, that's not how the State Bar ought to move forward, and certainly not in regard to these, to all the law schools here today and the other schools that aren't.
And it detracts from the credibility of the State Bar's position to reference it. It undermines your legitimacy referencing it.
Well, my question is here. Are we trying to discuss this, or are you telling us you're getting rid of the RAC? Because if you're telling us you're getting rid of the RAC, then why are we having this discussion?
Well, actually, I'm not telling you that. I think we've been quite clear about what the staff's recommendation is. Right now, what we're trying to do is to wrap up the issues around the assembly and the council, the concept of the working group. And so what I'd like to suggest is that we do that, and then we can move directly into the RAC and the accreditation. We can actually put up on the screen the slides that do reflect staff's recommendation, so that you're quite clear on what it is we're recommending and what we're not, as we move into a discussion about the RAC and law school accreditation.
Well, these go hand in hand, because you're telling us we get rid of the RAC and we use the law school council, we use the law school assembly, but the problem is the RAC meets every time that the CBD meets. And you want to go down from 7 times a year to 2 times a year? That does not sound like there's any kind of engagement. That sounds like you are cutting engagement.
So that's not the proposal at all, to be clear. The proposal is that we have ad hoc working groups that would meet as required to get the work product done. So if the work product is
We're going around in the circle, right?
If the work product is a revision to the accreditation guidelines and standards, there would be a working group established. Let's say that working group had a 12, 18, or 24-month charge. And let's say it had a composition that was comprised of 10 or 12 participants, okay? That would include typically a chair and a vice chair or 2 co-chairs of the working group. Those chairs, the leadership of the working group, working with assigned state bar staff, would determine the frequency at which the working group would meet. So as Donna referenced, we currently have a number of these going on. We have the malpractice insurance working group, we have job analysis, we have the access through technology and innovation task force that's about to begin. All of these, different compositions, different size, different durations, and they are meeting at different frequency levels. Some every quarter, some every other month.
You
So
don't understand RAC.
Well,
If you're comparing it to that, you do not understand
Just
RAC.
so I am completely in support of working groups as it relates to issues that affect all law students across California, regardless of the type of school that they attend, and that affect all new attorneys, if it's the exam or moral character issues, et cetera. I think that's a great idea. But you just framed it as accreditation, guidelines, and rules, which completely changes the conversation to, I may support a working group that is focused on a particular set of guidelines as it did in relation to online learning, but that the RAC would still be in place to act as a mechanism of review, just as I recommended the law school council. So if we're gonna stay on the law school council conversation, which I think is safer right now, I would suggest a working group on, let's say, moral character, because that's something that makes great sense to every single, so when you're talking about process as it relates to a generic conversation, I'm with you 100%. The minute you move to a working group and the elimination of the RAC as it relates to accreditation issues, now I get nervous. So do you want to wrap this up as it relates to generic issues, or do you want to move to accreditation issues?
I don't. I was responding to this comment where there was an assertion that staff was recommending that the RAC be eliminated and replaced with the council, which would only meet twice a year. I was clarifying that that was not staff's recommendation. And there was also a statement made that you can't bifurcate the issues, essentially, because the conversation about the RAC must be informed by this conversation about the council and the assembly. I have wanted to bifurcate the issues because I do think it overly complicates the conversation about the council and the assembly. And I've been hoping that we could wrap up that first part of the conversation so that then we could move into a discussion regarding the RAC and law school accreditation.
I'm with you as well on that.
Could I make a suggestion? I am prepared to stay till the end. I plan to do that. If we could have 10 more minutes on that first subject at the end, because every time I'm trying to introduce topics that relate to the first part of the agenda, it understandably, because of you all's very strong concerns, turns to the second issue. So we're not really able to have that discussion until you all can get your feelings about the other issue.
And Susan, if I could ask you just before you, and that may be a great idea, but since you played an active role in the council and the response to earlier concerns about ABA engagement, could you share with us your thoughts from an ABA law school? You did speak earlier, as another one of my colleagues, about the proposal to change the council, which has never been forwarded on, was to change the definition to bring associate deans, which I think you spoke in favor of. Former deans were added on that, changing the purpose language to be more definitive about what it did. And initially we talked about 3 times a year, because I really do find it hard to believe that you could convene and assemble a working group in 90 days. I just find that inconceivable. I don't think there's any history of that ever being done. And now you originally said, well, you've got the council 3 times a year that you absolutely know you're not waiting years for to convene. They're there. You could run a first
And
run
maybe
through.
one of those can be just planned as a telephonic meeting.
But so my thought is that since Steve Frillo talked about one thing,
and
I wondered what your thought
frankly, if
was.
we can't make this structure work, then I think, we'll all be saying we should continue the council. It doesn't turn out to be valuable. The other comment that I think is important is that maybe part of the problem is that there need to be some meetings that recognize that there are not as many commonalities of interest, and there should be separate meetings of the ABA deans and of the deans of the collectives and the unregistered, and just so that there might be more incentive to have the California accredited deans' broader participation. It's just that I think back to those law school assembly meetings in recent years, and while there were good things done at them, there was not an opportunity to in-depth really discuss much.
It's too big.
Because only so many people can speak, really. Those are the. But I don't think we should continue with the council if our new plan doesn't work.
But you'd be in favor of giving the new plan a chance.
Yeah, I don't feel terribly strongly about it, but I think thinking that the assembly is going to be able to play this role is.
So just to clarify, the new plan is 3 meetings a year, and it can include associate deans and not just deans? Is that what we're?
It also included, I think you had a slide on it, it included a more rigorous selection process. It also included a replacement process for any deans who were absent more than 2 times.
So we could throw people off who weren't attending.
Right. So I mean, it really forced engagement. You either participated or you got off and were replaced by your colleague schools.
So this was a mix of the proposal that was supported by several of the CALS deans that had been forwarded to me, which included in it an endorsement of the changes to the law school council, which had been approved by the law school council in June. So those were mixed together on that slide with that proposal would look like.
Just to simplify the discussion, I can't agree more with Dean Gardina. I mean, to keep the council and assembly, if the board were to define clearly, here's what their jurisdiction is, and it's Dean Gardina mentioned, it's obviously everybody here, no matter what kind of law school you have students who are going through the moral character process, you have issues with regard to bar exam. I mean, those are, the commonality is what brings deans from all the schools. And what's been proposed makes a lot of sense. It's just where there seems to be leakage between everybody around the table that, when you get into the committee's accreditation and regulatory function, which the ABA schools have no interest in, obviously. So to move the council as you see fit and as recommended, if you just had a clear line of demarcation between it and anything related to the committee's authority to accredit and regulate its law schools. Because again, and I think I speak for everybody, and by now it's self-evident, I mean, when you get to accreditation and regulation, the reason it generates the kind of discussion and heat that it does is it's an existential threat to a good portion of these law schools, including mine, that's been operating for 45 years. And I'm not alone in that. And so you just need to appreciate that. That's why you're going to hear some of the comments, because, and there are other schools that it is CALS that are not existentially threatened by what's being proposed, but who believe in the mission of all these law schools. So that's why there's the unanimity and the forcefulness with which you're hearing these comments. So if you separate anything to do with the CALS and the registered schools from the law school council, I think, the problem solved.
Yeah, I think this is the proposal, and right, maybe just a couple extra tweaks. One is have some sort of revised charter statement that it pertains to things that affect all law schools in common, and if you want to list what those broad categories are. And then just a practical suggestion, someone mentioned the idea of 3 meetings a year. Maybe having one be telephonic or, like a webinar. That way you'd have one from the California, one in Northern California, and then one via remote, and that way nobody ever has to travel, which no one wants to do anymore. I know, working in online school. And that way you're also never going more than about 4 months without a meeting. So if there is follow-ups that you need to have happen, then you can really sort of, gain some ground. I think that's a great idea.
And I would say, as the history was, if there was nothing to be discussed, the council does not have to convene. It's not, just put that right in there. If there's really nothing pending, don't have the meeting. We got other things to do.
Yes, and I think that's important. I mean, one of the things that we've seen over the course of the year is agendas for across committees, for sort of agendas because we've got a meeting scheduled. And what we don't need is a meeting where, law school council meets, followed by RAC, followed by CBE, and they have the same exact topics on the agenda. It's the same, it's not one recommending to the other and then the other adopting. That makes sense to have the same topic on the same agenda, but it's sort of the same informational item presented over and over, and that's of no value to anyone. And certainly the notion that we heard in San Francisco, and that we're hearing by the attendance itself at the Law School Council from the ABA deans is that the way that in part the attendance of the ABA deans has been limited because they haven't felt that the agendas were talking about those issues of the commonalities, the issues that were of import to the ABA deans, and so sort of having that, making sure that we're structuring them to talk about sort of those meatier issues that are common to all would make more sense.
I would say, given the discussion here, I think I'd eliminate the not vote part. We talked about that in the council, slightly different context. I find it very compelling what was discussed today, that if you want to send an associate dean because that's the topic of the day, absolutely there should be, if there's a vote, there should be. I would strike that, and you've opened it up yet one more time. We've got vice deans, associate deans, former deans. Whether it's 2 or 3 meetings a year, I like Marty's idea. The allowing everybody to vote when they come. I think you've really hit every one of the engagement buttons that I think were properly placed as challenges for the old way the council did. I don't know, Susan, what do you think from the ADA standpoint?
I agree. I'm looking at Jackie too, because she's been in those meetings.
Yeah, and I also think it meets the ultimate goals that you were tasked with, which is going back to that first slide, accountability, transparency, impartial, fair, and consistent decision-making and engagement. I think having a structure like this helps you tick all those boxes.
So the other suggestion that occurs to me is after the Supreme Court directed the studies relating to the bar, there were periodic telephone calls with, I believe, the ABA deans, and then Mitch was added in your role as chair. And I think it was the ABA deans because obviously these were studies that were heavily dependent on LSAT data. So I think that's why the CalAccreditors were more broadly involved. I found those phone calls to be quite well attended by deans, and so with some of the issues that might be taken care of in a newsletter, I think there is just so much that hits us all the time now. Deans' offices have very heavy fundraising burdens, most ABA deans' offices too. I think having those types of opportunities for deans to hear from staff about whatever the particular issue is, if you need to be focused on a particular issue, and we had sort of a standing early morning time for those, so it kind of took away the scheduling problems that you otherwise run into. And I think those were pretty effective. I'm looking at Mitch because you were on
We're well
some of
attended.
those.
Lots of
So I
students.
think that's another engagement device that might really be workable. I mean, even at the level of, we're thinking about convening a working group about, I'll just pick accommodation. We would find it useful to talk to any deans who want to help us think about what that study ought to include, or something that will mean that we're provoking people to think about something and provide some input early enough so that it could shape what was being done.
So I think one of the things I wouldn't want to get lost that made those so effective were there were a number of deans who had taken on the role of going out and collecting data and convening, and so it wasn't just staff reporting out. It was actually, again, it wasn't, you couldn't have that much conversation because there were too many people, but there were really a number of deans that actively worked on getting the information, bringing it back, reporting out, sharing, asking for opinions, and it allowed staff and consultants, if I remember, your concern with staff.
This was related to the law school performance study.
Yeah.
And, that's the type of study where, under our proposal, there would be a working group. There was, in fact, a working group for the whole series of studies. And the conversations with the dean, and those phone calls were an outcropping of that as the specific issue came up around sharing the data with the state bar.
And the ABA deans were the ones who were on the call because they were the ones who were participating in the study.
Well, and the ones that had the LSAT data.
We were trying to get others to participate in the study too, as I recall, so I think
I was on that.
was.
Yeah.
So, and I can think of some specific examples where, remember, part of the process was these groups that were convened to talk about, what an entry-level lawyer ought to know, and some of that was disturbing, and so that got more engagement. So I think it could be very useful.
Yeah, and that discussion will be happening with the job analysis working group that we've had a number of deans apply for participation on that working group as well.
And the Supreme Court will be making those selections. So any studies at the bar,
Just going back to this, so again, the idea that this doesn't eliminate the importance or value of an ad hoc working group, but it provides a formal structure and mechanism through which it operates, or recommendations are made, et cetera. So again, it doesn't have to be an either or. I think both works quite well, and will, again, tick all the boxes that you guys are trying to do when you're thinking about what you're tasked with.
So our plan that we announced on Tuesday was after taking the input of the group that met on Tuesday, then waiting until today, taking the input of the group that met today, that we'd be putting out a document next week to reflect the data that we received.
Which will be difficult for you because you're getting somewhat different reactions in the north and the south, I guess.
That's Civil War.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
I think we're at a good place.
Yes. So maybe we should.
Sorry.
Is the lunch outside?
Lunch is here, yes.
So why don't we break for 20 minutes, grab lunch, come back, and turn to the next topic.
Accreditation.
I'm sorry. No, sorry.
Okay, so to get started on the accreditation issues, and RAC, obviously. Just a couple of things again to during the values discussion, and what we are certainly interested in, what the values are that we're interested in protecting with this accreditation discussion. We mentioned sort of consumer protection issues. We want to make sure that you all understand that one of our values and one of the things that we understand very much is that the CALS and unaccredited law schools provide access to law schools for those who simply are not served by the ABA schools, whether you're talking geography, whether you're talking cost, whether you're talking, a working mom with 2 other jobs. We certainly understand that, and that is an important value that we provide that access to law schools for those who may not have an opportunity to attend the ABA schools. They are a lower cost opportunity, certainly for many. And also, we certainly understand that that you can't just focus on bar passage rate. Some of the reasons that people may attend a Cal or a Cal school or a registered school is because there is a value to some of just getting the JD and not getting bar passage isn't what they're necessarily going to law school for. The JD in and of itself gives them the promotional opportunities at work, the salary, possibilities for salary increases at work, and that's certainly something that is very important. Dean Spiro, to get to your issue, one of the things that we are also studying, we have just engaged in a justice gap study. We're about to embark on a justice gap study looking at the access to legal services. And we are modeling our study on work that was done by the Legal Services Corporation in 2017. But we have a couple of interesting angles that we have added to our justice gap study. And one of them is that we are also specifically looking at the impact that the cost of law school education in California has on access to justice. That is a specific charge. You can find that charge of the justice gap study laid out in our strategic plan, and that is one of the specific issues that we want to look at is the impact of the cost of law schools on access to justice. We will probably be reaching out to many of you as we go forward. We're going to potentially be looking at surveying law students, doing focus groups, a variety of things that we might be looking at to get an understanding from law students on the impact of the law school debt that they're going to be walking out of school with and how that impacts their ability, certainly not their desire, but their ability to take a job in a legal services organization. And so we certainly understand the importance that if you walk out of school without that kind of debt, you may be able to go forward with that interest that you have in serving lower income communities and working for a legal services provider. So I wanted to lay out the staff proposal that again was reflected in the report that went to the Board of Trustees in September. What our current thinking reflects is that there would be options for accreditation. To the extent that a school is accredited by a regional or national accreditor, they would be deemed accredited, similarly the way ABA schools are deemed accredited or approved. If there's other regional or national accreditors, WASC being one of them, that the school would be deemed accredited. In that instance, the accreditation, major change requests, things like that would be the responsibility of the regional or national accreditor. That wouldn't be something that would come through the CDE. However, some of the things that we're thinking that if you're not an ABA school and your accreditation is through one of these regional or national accreditors, we might probably still want CDE to be looking at, or State Bar staff looking at ensuring that the school is still meeting a minimum bar passage rate, that the school is submitting the required disclosures, but we wouldn't be doing the same kind of accreditation site visits that we do now if you are accredited by a regional or national accreditor. If you are not accredited by a regional or national accreditor, then you would continue to be accredited by California. We would continue a process of accreditation the way we do now for CALS. However, we do think that there really is a need for to take a significant look at the guidelines and to talk with other accrediting agencies and figure out what the best practices in accreditation are, set some values for accreditation. You know, what is the purpose of accreditation? Determine sort of the value and then structure the guidelines around that. If the point of accreditation is, and what we are looking for as a regulator is that your students pass the bar, then I may not care about what your physical library looks like. I may just care about your bar passage rate. That is obviously a crude example, but I'm just trying to sort of give you a sense of sort of what we're talking about when we're saying let's take a look at what is the purpose of us regulating you, and then figuring out what the appropriate guidelines would be, what we would be looking for in accreditation, in major change requests. I don't know that I would need to know when you changed an address. There are just certain things that we may want to do differently, and so we would have a group consider that. We also are proposing that we move forward with the allowing of accreditation for online schools, and that we would also move forward with a legislative strategy to pursue mandatory accreditation. And so again, for those, and that would be the proposal that had been adopted by CBE and the Board of Trustees, ultimately the Board of Trustees last November, that created a, Mitch, what did we say, 7-year path?
It's got a 7-year window to give everybody a chance to decide or teach out.
And so sort of using those changes that have improved that for that path to mandatory accreditation. One of the things that we talked about on Tuesday was making sure that we're not, that if we are looking at significant revisions to the guidelines, we're not flipping a switch and saying, okay, on, as of January 1, and it's December 30th, as of January 1, this is now what you need to be able to do. Obviously, schools are going to the extent that there's a change in guidelines that would require, you to teach differently, or to, obviously you need the time to be able to transition to those new guidelines, and so that's something that we had talked about on Friday. On Tuesday. And then, as you see, as we describe the revision to the guidelines here in the third bullet, we envision that as being done through one of the ad hoc working groups. And I turn it over to you all for your input.
I have a question. Does this mean that is it true that the staff proposal, that there's no part of the staff proposal that would require accreditation by anyone other than the committee bar directors and the state bar? In other words, not by WASP, not that.
Yes.
So a few questions, comments. So one is, in terms of the option of regional and national accreditation, if this is the path you go down, I think it may be worth clarifying what counts. Because, for example, Concord Law School is part of Purdue University Global. I apologize for Purdue Global because it's a mouthful. Purdue Global is accredited by the Higher Learning Commission, which is the federally recognized regional accreditor for the Midwest. We are part of that institution, but they don't separately review us for particular substantive, standards that might be specific to law schools. So, there would obviously be a question, since we're part of an HLC accredited institution, is that good enough for you guys, or do you still want us to go, maintain accreditation through the Cal Bars? That's something you need to think about the relation between those two types of issues.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
So a couple other things. So one is, obviously, all roads lead back to RAC. The point about a working group considering significant revisions of guidelines for CALs obviously begs the question, why not have RAC do that? Because that's what RAC's been doing for many years. And again, I'll hold my comments on RAC until we're squarely discussing RAC. And then the thing about path to mandatory accreditation. So my other question here is, and I've said this to others, we obviously would love to have the opportunity to be accredited. Whether we have to, whether we have the opportunity to, we're going to try as soon as we're able to. So I don't have a vested stake in whether it's mandatory or not. My only question is, well, I guess there's two issues, right? So one is, as you mentioned, RAC a couple of years ago now, or a year and a half ago, whatever, worked with the CBE, got recommended a package of rule and guideline changes that would open up the path for accreditation for online schools. It got voted up. And then the problem is that it was the mandatory accreditation part that I thought raised all the hurdles with, if not the Supreme Court, at a minimum, the California legislature. And so, as of earlier this year, I know there was discussion about, well, maybe if we don't make it mandatory, if we just make it an option but not mandatory, we can avoid the enabling legislation that mandatory accreditation would entail, and therefore avoid that extra hurdle of going back to the legislature. So, again, while I don't have a problem with moving towards mandatory accreditation, I'm just wondering, how you reconcile that potential problem. And then my last question or concern is talk about significant revisions to the guidelines. I mean, if it's things like we don't need to look at what kind of library you have or things like that, that's one thing. But I mean, my concern is the years-long process that already went into significant revisions to create that path for online accreditation, to reconcile it with the rules for existing fixed facility schools and cleaning some other things up. I'm concerned that if there's going to be a whole nother round of revisions, A, is that going to conflict with the online-related revisions that were already recommended and approved, because then we're just going back to the drawing board and possibly worse. And B, is it going to just slow that whole process down where, a path to accreditation gets held up by another 2 or 3 years because of these other changes that you get approved first. So I know it's throwing 3 or 4 things at you, but that's what I got based on that slide.
Let me start with your last point first, because it's a discussion that we had very directly in San Francisco, and I want to make sure to say the same thing here. We are not interested in saying that the revisions to the rules would slow down the path to accreditation for the online schools. We understand that yes, there are guidelines for the online schools. We're teasing those apart from the changes for mandatory accreditation. But what we are not saying is, because we know that the other rules would change pursuant to a process, we're going to put the online accreditation option on hold until we get the rest of the guidelines. We are saying that we'll move forward with the online, the option for online accreditation under the guidelines as they exist. There's some minor tweaks that we've talked about with the chair of RAC on the guidelines, but that those would move forward while we are then examining the other guidelines for the other guidelines for accreditation. And so, to the extent that anybody else would have to change to address any of the changed guidelines, the same would be true at that point for the online schools who would become accredited.
Oh, go ahead. Are you going to talk about the legislative issue?
I was, but you can.
So during the course of our many meetings and discussions related to the 2019 fee bill, we addressed this issue very directly with the legislative folks that are interested. And certainly at the beginning of that process, you're correct, there was a reluctance to pursue mandatory accreditation. I think it's fair to say at this point, we're comfortable that there is a willingness in Sacramento to pursue it.
Okay.
So that's where we think it's viable at this time.
And along that same line, Leah, when you were talking with the legislators about the fee bill and some of the other issues that the state bar was undertaking, did you bring up this idea of deemed accredited? Because at least outsourcing to WASC was part of the conversation early on. So any take on whether the legislature was open to expanding deemed accredited to include others?
No, we have not discussed, this is very new, so we have concluded those meetings around the fee bill, I believe in July. So no, we haven't discussed this proposal. With many of the proposals or the recommendations or resolutions that the board adopted with respect to the sub-entities, they will require legislative changes. And so part of our immediate next step with respect to those decisions that the board has already made is to develop implementation plans. And for many, the implementation plans include communicating with the legislature, namely the judiciary committees during the recess. So this would be one of the issues that we would be discussing.
Well, I want to thank I want to thank the staff for being open to looking more broadly at this issue and being open to compromising proposals. And I really appreciate the value slide that you put up. I think that you reflected well what draws us all to the Cal and registered schools, and what draws our students there. So I appreciate that. You know, I think there's probably a lot of work to be done inside of this slide, a lot of questions and other things that need to be answered that we're not able to unpack here until we really start to think about what are the implications of this. But I think it's a much better approach than that binary approach that we had, which is either outsource or in-house. So I appreciate the flexibility built into the proposal.
If I can tag team with Gardina, as I read this is very good news, because I think it's fair to say that the WASC issue is a dead letter, a mandatory one, because it just was, as I've said to many people, just an enormous square peg being shoved into a very small hole. It just made no sense on so many levels. And so, you know, not having that sort of Damocles hanging over the heads of virtually half the schools, that would be very questionable for an expense, primarily due to expense, is great news, because I think it now gets us to a place that, that satisfies the staff and the players concerned and serving the schools. So thank you.
And we had also talked, we put up the slide on Tuesday about the group of CalFeeds, the proposal that had been provided that was attached to the agendas for today's meeting. And I think largely we agreed that sort of the structure of this CalFeeds proposal and the staff proposal were pretty well aligned. The issue obviously is RAC and the extent of revision to the guidelines, but that the concepts were generally aligned. I did want to mention that I did receive an alternate proposal, which I believe was, I was told was going to be emailed to all of the CALS deans from one of your colleagues. And that proposal for accreditation was that the CALS go back to being accredited by the Bureau of Private Post-Secondary Vocational Education.
So I can share with you that we had a teleconference and several meetings, so 14 of the 15 CALs are in favor of this approach, not that.
I just did not want to, I just didn't want to be accused of hoarding information.
No
I wanted
and
to
it
make
was
sure
circulated, we had a
that
chance to look at it,
Yeah.
and we, as an example of what the CALs do, we talked about it. And this has widespread.
Which would require, it was exactly 10 years ago that the Dunn bill went through, and if you look at the statutory enabling act with regard to the Bureau, it specifically and expressly excludes law schools. So you'd have, that would...
I'm familiar with the statutory.
It would take quite a heavy lift, I think, to go down that road.
Chief Franco?
Just a question on this one with the deemed accredited concept. WASC is just one regional accreditor. It has over 200 institutions in California to Kenya to Armenia. How would this interplay with initial accreditation? are we gonna see the 200, that's its cows jump up?
So the idea that initial accreditation would be available through the California State Bar, through WASP, through DIAC. You know, we need to sort of make sure that we're identifying, you know, not through, what was it, not through, you know, the accreditor for, you know, psychology schools, but for institutional accreditors, for, you know, DIAC doing the distance education. Initial accreditation would be available that way. So you wouldn't have to start with California State Bar accreditation. You could start with accreditation from which.
Well, what would they do in the first year exam? Because, you know, if they go DIAC, they're not going to require, they're not going to mandate the first year exam to become DIAC accredited. So would that eliminate if the school goes another route in the first year?
We're not contemplating that. So that would go under that bullet. They could go, what would we continue, in the other slide, what would we continue to require even of schools who are accredited through another accrediting body? Certainly we haven't contemplated eliminating that requirement.
Okay, can I ask a question? If you're talking about having it where schools have the opportunity to be regionally, nationally accredited, to be deemed Cal accredited, but you're still accrediting schools that don't go down that path, what's the benefit to the bar, I guess, of offering that additional option? Other than, I mean, I guess it takes some of the administrative work off your plate. Is that the main benefit?
It takes some of the work off our plate, and I think one of the issues that came up through the sub-entity reviews, the review of the CE, was, are we an appropriate accrediting body? There are other entities that do this full-time. This is their business. It's not the business of the State Bar. And hence that initial recommendation, which was to basically say, we're contracting this out and you must become WASC accredited. That's what we walk back from. So the thinking is, if a school has done the work to become accredited by one of these institutions where this is their core business, then the State Bar should recognize it. The state already recognizes the ABA accreditation. So it's just recognizing additional accreditations. That's the basis. So yes, it reduces our administrative burden. That's not the primary impetus. The impetus is to recognize that there are professional accrediting bodies, and there's no reason for us not to recognize them. However, I think the issue is, what in addition are we going to require? And we had a very interesting discussion in San Francisco about things like curriculum requirements. And this goes to that whole big macro question of what's the purpose of accreditation. And you could go to, and I had a really interesting conversation with the new head of WASC, who I think is very forward-leaning and would like to go in the direction of only outcomes-based accreditation. And in our world, that might be bar pass, customer satisfaction. I think that's really important, the student satisfaction with their experience, and employment. I mean, you could go to a very small number of outcomes if you really went in that manner. I don't know why I went on that tangent, but anyway. That's the interesting thing when you think about accreditation for the part that the bar keeps, those schools that the bar, where we retain. I think we should engage in that kind of conversation about what is the purpose, and are we measuring the right things based on a common understanding of what the purpose of accreditation is.
Leah, some of that sounds great, but I do have a correction. The Committee of Bar Examiners is in the business of accreditation and has been. And to suggest that it's not, I get where that's coming from, but it's a complete misstatement. And that's not personal, that's fact.
Just so that, since you have the benefit, a dozen and a half law deans here, many of us who have decades in the business and dealing with accreditation, I think the idea of looking for simplistic measurements, such as solely looking at minimum pass rate and something as out of the ordinary to even a vague understanding of what we would like to do in public protection and accreditation as a customer survey is, it doesn't benefit this argument. I think it reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of 60 years of accreditation of Cal schools. And we've actually been accrediting law schools longer than WAS. We preceded WAS in the accreditation of California accredited law schools. So I would have to second Darren's comment that if there's anybody who's an expert in accrediting non-ABA law schools, it's the State Bar of California. You've been there longer than any other entity in existence.
And that's a national phenomenon.
And so there, to talk to what Marty said, the idea of over 60 years to have a body of regulations to say that might be boiled down to two numbers is, I fear say, as a fundamental misunderstanding or naive view of why this has existed. And truly, it hasn't existed because all of us like doing annual reports and 5-year site visits. We wouldn't voluntarily put ourselves through the hundreds of hours of prep, but we do it because we think it's really beneficial to our organizations. And we've worked hard to revise these rules in a way that we think really reflects quality and rigor. And so when you combine a comment like that with the idea of taking development oversight of the rules away from us, perhaps it's easier to understand why we think you may not get it.
Well, it's not taking it away from you. The staff recommendation is to not have a RAC, a standing subcommittee of the Committee of Bar Examiners, but instead to have accreditation guidelines and standards developed by a working group that would in fact be comprised of you, not selected by us. So that is the distinction. It is not the idea that this kind of very complex work would be done in a black box by State Bar staff. That's not the suggestion or the recommendation.
What's the problem with RAC?
But you go back to the 6 points you started with of what you were going to use, please. The 6 elements you were going to measure sub-entities by, because that would help us walk back through the 6 elements. Very good. There. So let's put RAC through this filter. Because this is what you said the task force on governance tasked you to do. So where does it fail, and how can we fix it? How can we fix this to make this meet your needs?
Change the name. We have had challenges to the RAC based on concerns about transparency and accountability. Those came up most recently, to my knowledge, related to a request or the process by which an expansion request was being considered. Clear lines of authority. Certainly the board has little to no exposure as to what the RAC is doing. I don't know that the RAC makes decisions per se, so I'm not sure that that one applies. I think they're very engaged, and I don't know that size is an issue. To be clear, RAC does not count as a sub-entity from the definition that the board has articulated. It is not a sub-entity of the bar, it is a subcommittee of the Committee of Bar Examiners. So these are the general principles that were applied to the sub-entity review. But I think in terms of the concerns we received, and I know that some of you have received it, but I guess maybe it was not circulated to all deans, a letter that we received from the chair of the Judiciary Committee expressing concerns about the RAC, and those things have been reiterated to some of us that meet regularly with the members of the legislature. And I would pose the counter question to all of you, which is my lack of understanding about what would be so fundamentally lost in an alternative structure. So for example, we just did a major revision to the rules of professional conduct. That was done by a working group that was established, limited term, got extended, developed the rules, submitted them to the Supreme Court for approval. So imagine that now we've moved forward, we've decided we're gonna recognize, we've gotten legislative agreement, we're gonna recognize regional creditors, but we need to figure out what is it that in addition the CALs need to be required to do or to report. So that's the question, what's in addition to the regional accreditation? What would be lost, what would you not have if you had a process where you had a working group comprised of CALs and perhaps others that said, this is your charge, come up with this, a recommendation about what additional requirements should be imposed. That went up to the Committee of Bar Examiners, went to the Board of Trustees. What is the fundamental problem with not having a standing committee comprised of a set membership as opposed to a working group of CALS deans and registered deans that would rotate over time based on the working group topic itself? Yes.
So if I could, let me answer one so, because I know you tried, George, Darren, tried to put this to rest. So, the issues dealt with by the General Counsel's office, your lawyer, related to the composition of the RAC, which you just referenced again, because that's what was in Assemblymember Stone's letter. So I went to visit him. So it's just so I can share with everybody and you as well. So that would be helpful since they drafted the letter. And they were quite surprised that the bar had not forwarded to them the antitrust decision that had been rendered 3 months before that letter was written, that answered absolutely every concern raised in the letter. They were concerned why the bar didn't answer their office. So the question is why that letter still stands is because at least when I went to talk to them, you hadn't done your job in responding. I said to them, let's just click on the link in the office. It had been posted there for months. Why you keep bringing that up is either insulting to the 17 lawyers in this room who know how to read an attorney's report, or to you. And I don't know how else we can say it. You keep bringing up something that is the exact dead letter. I don't know how George could say it any more clearly. I just don't get it. And now if you wonder why we think you don't get it, please help me. I can't make it any more clear than that. I went to the source. We discussed it with them. We outlined it. We showed them the history documents. We showed them the legal opinion. The fact that you haven't responded to them is nothing we can address. But
we have responded to them. I really just take issue with your tone. We've responded, and I ask you to contemplate that there may be other conversations that we have with our legislative stakeholders that you are not part of or privy to. So that's all I can say. We have responded.
Does that sound, you said to me at our break,
assume
you're operating in good faith? No.
So
there's a history of trust.
So the issue here is,
and it's not personal,
about the RAC.
It's about a job.
Subcommittee of the Committee of Bar Examiners. What the material difference is between that and a working group. That's the question that I've asked.
It just turned on its head.
This woman had her hand up. She's had her hand up. I would love to hear somebody answer that question.
I take issue with the analogy you offered, because you offered an analogy of something that's one-dimensional in the rules regarding professional conduct, when we're talking about entities that live and breathe in different regions and we're completely different. So analogizing those two, of course we're going to take issue with the RAC being dismantled or just completely discontinued, because our problems arise as we go, and it's not just an existing set of rules. And trying to force them to be the same is just not possible.
are you saying it does more than make recommendations regarding rules and guidelines?
I'm saying that,
It's a-
yes, it does, because it relates to each school as they are like an entity, like they're like people. They're not just like flat rules. So to analogize those, it's not the same. And that is where the ire comes from on our parts. We may be individual representatives, but we represent living, breathing entities, our schools.
I've got a point of order, if I may.
Well, I would like to call in Jackie. I
Please,
just
go ahead,
like,
yeah.
yes, go ahead.
So I'm going to try to answer your question. I don't think I can tell you a material difference, but let me put it in context. For me, the timing is bad. You're talking about incredible upheaval to the CAL system and to the registered system happening. The RAC is an established and trusted source for the CALs and at times the registered schools to voice their concerns, to give their guidance to the CBE when it comes to major policy decisions. Like my comment as it related to the Law School Council, I think there's an absolute place for working groups with diverse voices and diverse expertise, but I again would have any recommendations that they make go to the RAC as an established process and an established body that's trusted by the stakeholders most affected by the changes that are going to be recommended before going to the CBE, just as it has been. I think, again, it goes back to ticking those boxes. Accountability, transparency, impartial, fair, and consistent decision-making and engagement. I think timing-wise, it's a bad time to eliminate the RAC. It could be after the upheaval is over, after things settle down, we step back and say, is the Rules Advisory Committee a necessary part of the new way that the State Bar is operating in relation to the accredited, deemed accredited, registered, whatever we're going to be called at that point. But right now is the worst time to eliminate the RAC. So I say it's a good future state to look towards. It's not a current state.
Thank you, yeah.
So a practical difference I can identify, which is admittedly hypothetical, but it's necessarily hypothetical. So let's say, based on the conversation we had before lunch, we say we're going to provide the option of outsourcing accreditation to regional accreditors. We're going to have a working group figure out what else needs to be done, right? We're not going to have RAC, right? Well, as we talked about before lunch, it seems like where we landed on was the Law School Council, not staff of the bar, would decide who's going to be the composition of that working group. Let's say the Law School Council effectively, everyone just votes their own interest and effectively replicates itself, right? So we decide that there's going to be 3 CBE members, 6 ABA deans, 2 CALS deans, 2 registered deans, and 1 board trustee member. And everyone just votes their own interest, right? You could have a situation where the 6 deans of ABA schools, and no offense to uses, unless I'm just going to assume everyone's a bad actor, right? The 6 ABA deans and at least 2 members of the bar could get together and say, we don't like this whole idea of CALs anymore, and we think we should make it as hard on them as possible to exist. And we think that they should have a 75% bar pass rate, notwithstanding we just acknowledge that they have certain challenges or student population certain challenges that most ABA students don't have. Or maybe we should say there should be a 90% bar pass rate or whatever, right? The representatives of the CALs and the registered schools would be powerless to do anything about that, right? Because they didn't pick the committee, right? As George pointed out, one of the virtues of RAC is that it's by design, worst case scenario, is deadlocked because it's made of half CBE members and half members selected by CALs. Now I recognize that the ostensible weakness in this argument is that whether it's a working group or whether it's RAC, it's still just a recommendation. They don't get to vote. So even if the working group were sort of taken over by forces hostile to CALs or registered schools, it'd still just be a hostile recommendation, not a hostile vote. But if we assume that recommendations are worth anything, we assume that the potential for a loaded group that makes a recommendation could still be detrimental, especially when, as we've acknowledged, the ABA schools aren't affected by issues that are particular to CAL schools. There are issues in which we have common interests, and that's what we said before the break. It made sense for Law School Council to address. accommodations, bar pass, moral character, things like that, right? But when it comes to things that only affect the cows, the risk of a working group is you might have other voices which might not just be independent, but potentially hostile to cows, right? Deciding to favor or making recommendations that carry weight with regard that only affect cows and registered schools to the extent that they aspire to be cows. So I think there is really an institutional risk of changing the structure, even of an advisory council, to the extent that you're having non-cows recommenders impacting the fate of the cows themselves. That's where I think there's a concern in terms of accountability, transparency, and clear lines of authority, as well as impartial, fair, and consistent public decision making. So that I think is the concern.
And that, I think we did address on Tuesday, and the idea would be if it's a accredited law school issue, there would only be accredited law school representation or registered law school representation on that particular working group, and the decisions about who to appoint to it would be made by that particular population. So that.
But then at that point, it's so close to RAC. Why not just keep RAC?
Well, it is. It's different because it's not a standing subcommittee of the committee of bar examiners, in which the subject matter would be very specific, and the composition of the committee would change with respect to the particular issue being addressed.
And the problem with being a standing subcommittee is.
Well, it may be that having 3 members of CBE and the same 3 members of CBE on each of those discussions, that might not, if we were pulling together a working group today on the example that Leah started with, so if we were putting together a working group today on, for those schools that are accredited by a regional or national accreditor, what are the other things we require? And pulling together a working group on, for let's look at the rules for those who are going to be Cal accredited. Would we put the same 3 members of CBE on each of those working groups? I don't know that we would, but the way RAC works, you have its standing members. So even if we were just looking at the CBE side of it, it's certainly something that we would have greater flexibility to consider.
This gentleman has been trying to speak for a while. Are you done?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, this really is a point of order. I think everybody agrees with it. We should not be interrupting each other. And I noticed that every time somebody's interrupted, the person interrupted is a woman. So.
Please.
No, I'm sorry. You're wrong in interrupting women.
And I have noticed that myself, which is why I'm specifically trying to call on the women that have had their hands raised. Go ahead.
So, kind of working off of what Jackie was saying earlier and some of what we discussed on Tuesday. Sorry, I'm kind of losing my voice that could go out a little bit, so I'll try. But so based on some of the discussions that we had on Tuesday and referencing what Jackie was saying on her side a little bit earlier, it is a very tumultuous time. I mean, there are a lot of very strong opinions right now, but I think that we're circling around some similar issues. And speaking to some of the concerns that you have, I think that it's perhaps we're able to make a compromise in that we perhaps have a period of time in which we maintain RAC, but change the composition of the members so that we can form something with additional opinions, change some of the members perhaps from the CBE, or add additional members from the Board of Trustees, or I think, forgive me, I don't remember if it was Leah or Donna who mentioned bringing in an outside expert on accreditation. So adding somebody like that to the actual RAC composition, and I believe that we have an institutional history of allowing outside experts, so I believe the standing rules already allow it. So we could increase the number of deans, we could increase or decrease the number of CBE members, bring in experts, meet the concerns of the people that are in this room, and then I believe, not to forgive me, I don't remember who mentioned it on Tuesday, but then we could then perhaps have a sunset on RAC, say 5 years, and then at the end of 5 years, we would review it. That would give us the time necessary to review the rules as we're interested in doing, it seems, and meet all of the concerns in the room. Esther?
I have George have his hand up before we out.
Okay. Go ahead.
After.
George, thank you.
Well, thank you. So on several points, one, I agree with Elizabeth. I mean, There are several issues and a lot going on here. Is one, I see no distinction between a recommendation coming from the RAC and a recommendation coming from a working group other than the standing committee issue. And what I think the mistake you're making is and again, I'm a historian here, is understand the incredible value that members of the Committee of Bar Examiners, and I'll name them by name, Larry Scheinfeld and others, contributed, and this idea that somehow volunteers are the problem, his commitment and dedication and the number of hours that he put into doing what? Seeing that the committee improve the education offered by the towns. And so by only having ad hoc members of the committee who don't have the expertise or frankly the motivation to get involved with the process completely weakens and waters down to the point of having no impact at all what the committee input in with regard to what a RAC or a working group would come up with. So there's that point. The other point that Elizabeth makes is a good one. I think, and I'd be here to the first to advocate, is that the jurisdiction of the RAC should be expanded to include the unaccredited rules and guidelines, particularly given where we may end up with mandatory accreditation and the like. It makes more sense, if you want more engagement, registered deans would be far more motivated than they have been to attend meetings and be involved in the process. Perhaps even having, if you expanded the scope, having one or two registered deans on the revised new RAC. And that would give the committee a far better platform to make informed decisions. So don't dismiss and ignore the contributions that the committee themselves, members have made to the RAC. And on another point with regard to somebody Stone's letter, I mean, everyone who read that letter in the know knew exactly who the author of that letter was. It was literally cut and paste and verbatim. And so, again, it's a little upsetting to me, knowing how self-serving that effort was to have that letter written and to have it today continue to affect in any way, shape, or form of this discussion is, I think, is a travesty. So there's that point as well. So, the RAC itself has historically operated and having worked on it, worked for it for 10 years and gone to 65 plus CBE meetings. It's hard to understand or encapsulate today the many real accomplishments and improvements, which brings me to my last point. In this discussion of accreditation, what has been missed or ignored or not understood is this, is regional accreditors look at an institution in a very different light. The committee for 80 years has looked at its accreditation function in a very narrow, focused manner. And that is to see that there's an affordable pathway to the profession in terms of allowing an individual from all kinds of diverse economic, geographic, and ethnic backgrounds to earn a JD degree and become a licensed California attorney. The RAC does little else but help the committee achieve that goal of maintaining accreditation standards and, more to the point, improving the accreditation standards. And I think everyone at this table would agree, if you went back 10 years ago today and looked at where the CALs were operating without a 40% minimum pass rate, without the recent changes to the rules and guidelines with regard to practical skills requirements, the CALs as a whole are operating at a higher level and a more effective level than they were 10 years ago. And a lot of that success is due directly to the RAC. And I think everyone agrees that without the RAC, the CALs wouldn't be where they are today and won't be where they would be in the future without the RAC. So eliminating it literally, if what you're saying is true, that you want increased engagement, you want transparency, you want consumer protection, that's what the RAC has been doing. When it comes to notice requirements, you name it, that's what the RAC has done. And eliminating it serves no other purpose than, frankly, consolidating the authority in fewer hands when it comes to what the committee says or does with regard. And as long as the committee is going to be, and I hope it does under this new staff proposal, continue to accredit schools, the accredited rules and guidelines are essential. They're going to maintain a quality education of new schools that are provisionally accredited, and the RAC will play an essential, a future role of RAC will play an essential role in that. I think it's as simple as that. Getting rid of it literally makes no sense other than for other political purposes. And what those are, I'm not even entirely sure.
So I had two questions. I understand that the reason for these proposed changes is driven by the need for accountability, transparency, and to encourage consistent decision-making. So with respect to eliminating RAC and replacing it with working groups, RAC is subject to the Bagley-Keene Act, and it's, in a public setting, and it encourages public participation, whereas working groups are not subject to the Bagley-Keene Act. So my first question is, how is accountability and transparency being encouraged by eliminating RAC and replacing it with working groups? My second question is, with respect to encouraging or trying to have consistent decision-making, when we rely on ad hoc working groups where we don't even know who the members will be for each working group versus having a RAC where we already have a set members involved, I feel like having RAC where there are already set members involved, that would encourage consistent decision making. So how does that work for a working group?
So with respect to the former, we have several working groups going right now that are subject to the Bagley-Keene Act. It depends on how they're formed, and that certainly could be built into the model. So just because it's not a working group does not mean that it's not subject to Bagley-Keene or that the meetings can't be open. So that's sort of an easy one. The other, when I went over these procedures, I skipped that one because I did not think that the RAC was a decision-making body. I understand that the RAC makes recommendations. So I agree with your point. The purpose of the RAC, as I understand it, is not to make decisions. So,
but then with respect to make consistent recommendations for decisions to be made, how is consistency improved by having a working group in lieu of a set RAC?
So the decision-making body, depending on what the issue is, would be the CBE, the board, or the Supreme Court in certain instances, and that's where that consistency value is being, I think, demonstrated. There's other goals around generating a sufficient number of voices at the table for the formation of the recommendations under this other model. It's just a different sort of approach to how you get a lot of voices at the table, and then the entity that's making the decision, there is stability in that composition.
I just want to get back to the reason we're having this meeting.
Mm-hmm.
Could you explain that to us? Because if the reason is to make us want to get rid of the RAC, it's not going to work. If the reason is because you've already decided on what you want to replace it with, then we shouldn't even waste our time being here. I mean, I'm really kind of not understanding. If you're going to get rid of RAC, then why do you want our input?
Well, it's not my decision to make. So there's the two issues we're talking about today are law school engagement and accreditation. And certainly we've gotten a lot of feedback about the council and the assembly, and in addition to the RAC. So that was the purpose of these meetings that we've had, and we've gotten those. The accreditation, we've presented in these meetings a different staff proposal from the original proposal. The idea is to get feedback regarding that, and we're also getting feedback regarding the RAC. We have a task given to us by the board. We need to come back to the board with a set of staff recommendations that reflect the input that we've gotten. Not that's necessarily in accordance with it, but it is reflective, and we provide to the board all of this input. So that's the purpose. And I think, as Donna indicated, we will be providing, I think, not just a summary of the feedback we've received, but in our initial thinking about what it is that staff will present to the board after these meetings that we've had this week, so that then all of you will see that well in advance of any board meeting and can make determinations about what you want to do next accordingly. So that's the purpose, and I think a lot of this has been really helpful, and you will see it reflected in what we put out as what staff intends to recommend, clarifications around what does it mean to recognize a regional accreditor. There are obviously a number of issues that we haven't identified, we need to think through further. The Law School Council, Law School Assembly issue, you will see your ideas reflected back. And the RAC, I mean, it's very helpful for me to hear something like, now is not a good time, and particularly when you're recommending all of these other changes, but that doesn't mean that we have to keep it exactly the way it is. Maybe there is some willingness to adding some additional voices. So I think that's the purpose of the meetings. And that's kind of what I'm doing with notes, and we'll discuss that in order to come up with what our recommendation will be.
I think the previous was last year.
Okay.
These guys may be more directly, I want to shift just a little bit, so maybe right on what you're talking about.
Well, what springs to mind to me is if we have the continual formation of working groups regarding discrete issues, and yet it's the same group of people meeting on issues that are just a little bit gradations up, are we going to continue to reconstitute working groups within the same group of people, and then we'll say, I'm on this working group, and I'm on this working group, and they're kind of all within the same ambit that the RAC would have handled anyway? Is that efficient? And I don't expect an answer, I'm just posing that as a hypothetical. And in that sense, I think the RAC exists and does answer issues that come up in the organic course of running these schools.
On that point, if someone could go back and recreate history, or at least understand the history of the time and effort that, again, you hear this, but Gail and I spent dealing with the deans to come up with what I think we all agree is a major accomplishment, the 40% MPR rule. And it didn't come up overnight. It was a lot of discussion, debate, and to talk to Jackie's predecessor, no one other than Heather Georgiakis and I, we spent the better part of 6 hours one day on the phone trying to work out the formula of how the MPR would be calculated. And without the RAC, I'm not sure then Dean Georgiakis would have had any motivation, interest, or to do that. And this gets me to my real point, is what's troubled me politically through this process, and I watched all the board meetings, is frankly the utter lack of understanding or education that the board members have, making these fundamentally important decisions about entities. And I know the RAC well, I'm not going to speak to others. And to be frank and to be blunt, they have been misinformed. The Parker report, if they had read Winnick's memo to Mr. Schaffler, was riddled with inaccuracies and false assumptions. I'm more than happy, if you have an hour of your time, to go through it and point out every one of them, because I know I've read it myself. You've given the deans 2 and 3 minutes of public comment to try to make a case about why an entity such as the RAC, what it's done, why it's relevant, why it's essential. And now, with 2 or 3 more minutes of public comment at the next board meeting, on top of what you're going to report, and it's good to hear you're going to be fair reporters, to certainly report the extent and the detail of why everyone here has said as loudly as they have, the RAC is important, successful, essential, and that its elimination literally on so many levels makes no sense at all. Other than if there are hidden agendas and hidden threats of litigation, then we're handicapped, because you're right, we don't have that information. But the history and should be enough if the board was educated to say, no, this makes sense, and we're going to leave it, or we're going to expand it. We can tinker with it, but just eliminating it, with a stroke of a pen, I think is upsetting, as it obviously is in everybody's seeing.
So I want to make a point that I think is related to this, but not directly. And I'd like to ask, because I don't understand, does anyone have any idea of how many of the Cal accreditates, for example, have WASC accreditation?
There's,
About a third.
yeah, and nine are pursuing. There's 3 additionals that are pursuing.
Because I'm early on in that process because Southwestern is a freestanding school, so our ABA accreditation only covers the JDs. So if we want to do other programs, we can't do that with accreditation. And I have really serious reservations about you replacing this structure that's been developed in California for our non-ABA law schools with WASC. I mean, WASC has very little experience with law schools. And it is not aimed at thinking about the kinds of things that we worry about in our discipline, like the multiple facets of consumer protection. I think it has a value because legal education in general has been behind in the areas of assessment. But it seems to be, and I think your comment early on, helped me focus on this, it's all about assessment. And it's like, we just want you to be assessing. And I just think that while there may be other important reasons to think about getting out of the accreditation business, what I worry about is that as the regional accreditors do more of this with freestanding schools, and that's the other problem. For a freestanding school, WASC is a very expensive alternative, and I believe that the levels of scrutiny are on a different planet than they would be for you as a part of a mega university. And I don't think that's a good thing for serving the access mission, which is this theme that runs throughout California history, from the sitting at the foot of a lawyer to the rich development of the alternative of the non-ABA schools. And so I think you're stepping into potentially very destructive territory, because what can then happen is what's been happening at the ABA, where the ABA could care less about the fact that the California bar is more difficult than other bars. Its standards, because of pressures from the Department of Education, are becoming more and more like we have this central government regulation, as is the case in many countries in the world. It hasn't been the case in the US before. And they're going to things like employment and bar passage, and we know the relationship of those two things. And so I think it has the potential to be very destructive of California remaining a place of opportunity that recognizes that because of the difficulty of our bar pass rates are not going to look like those in other places. So I think there's a really big issue here that I did not appreciate before this discussion.
Susan, we welcome you on RAC. ABA enough. You're welcome. Come.
Can I make one other point? I know you're by now well tired of hearing my voice, but a point that hasn't been discussed is consumer protection. And again, I'm going to go back and fall back on my own experience. As staff to the committee, with its regulatory and accreditation function, I would get 2 or 3 calls a month from law students. My favorite was a young woman who was very upset at her law school because she didn't like the dorm room that she got assigned. And it hurt, and as soon as I said, by the way, what school do you attend? And when she mentioned an ABA school, I said, that's great. We don't do ABA schools. Here's the ABA. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, I came into work one day, and there were 5 messages on my machine, and in the course of the first hours there, I got calls from a dozen students at a registered unaccredited school that the bottom had dropped out, and we took, committee and staff, immediate action. And I'm proud, I guess, where I did my job. At least a half dozen schools don't exist today because we got calls from students, because they're on the front lines. They know when mistakes are being made, when things aren't being done correctly. They don't always know who to call or what the recourse is. But the committee has a sound rule that if a student complaint relates to accreditation or regulatory issue, staff has the authority to then take action, go to the committee. Moving forward, I just say that when those calls would come in to some future staff person, and they find out the school's WASC accredited or DIAC accredited, they're going to say, hey, great, I don't have to deal with this. Call DIAC, call WASC. And I can imagine the kind of response that somebody at WASC or DIAC is going to have with regard to it. So from a strictly consumer protection, the committee and its staff, and I know this is self-serving, I think has done and has historically done a good job in being one, because that's what's said during inspections. I'm sure every dean here knows that when I went to a school and other consultants went to school, if you have issues with your school, here's the number to call. So, if that's a point that hasn't been discussed, and I think it's important. And when it comes to just basic consumer protection, the committee and its staff does far better than an ABA, a WASC, or any other regional.
So,
sorry, I'll just add for what it's worth. I don't feel as strongly about the option of regional accreditation as I do about this RAC issue. But I will say, even though I don't know that it will affect our school, I think at the end of the day, the State Bar will likely find that if the idea is to have the option of regional accreditation, but yet you're still going to have an overlay of what are the things that the Cal Bar is going to require instead, at the end of the day, you're not going to save yourself that much work, because when and in whatever form you do that work of figuring out what are the things we really need to make sure are in place, whether it's a couple of bare bones things like bar pass and employment and disclosures, or whether it's a more full-blown thing, at the end of the day, if you're requiring that of all schools, once you require of all schools whatever you think is important, you're basically accrediting all of them anyway. So I don't even know how much you gain by saying, oh, here's this DIAC or WASC overlay where they're insisting on a bunch of assessment, whatever. I just don't know how much that ends up saving you.
So I think we have received obviously quite a lot of input on the entire agenda, but certainly on the RAC issue. And I'd be prepared to close the meeting, but I want to make sure that there aren't any final comments, that people haven't had an opportunity to say that we haven't heard that topic.
At the last meeting that we had, the accreditation issue came up, and I recall that Ms. Wilson said to us it didn't have anything to do with the cost of accreditation by the bar. And yet, when I read the report, the first thing that came under each one of those issues of weeding or sending out accreditation to other accreditors was a cost to the bar. So I just wanted to bring that up.
Are you talking about the appendix, the sub-entities report that went to the board?
Yes.
That's because the board requested for each recommendation a fiscal analysis and a staffing impact analysis.
I said a question. So you're going to write up a potential revised staff proposal. Now, procedurally, you may have mentioned this, but I missed it. Does it go to the CVE and then the board of trustees, or go straight to the board of trustees? What's the next steps?
This is going straight back to the board.
And so the report will mention, I wasn't in San Francisco, but it sounds like there was basically unanimous opposition to the idea of removing RAC?
Yes.
That will be mentioned?
And also,
I'm sorry, it was confusing what you were asking the board meeting. Yes, from our meeting in San Francisco, I think that's fair to say. The same feedback.
So whatever gets forward to the board of trustees will mention.
If
If it's the case, the staff proposal is not to leave RAC, right? It'll at least mention that there was unanimous opposition from the audience to eliminating RAC.
Absolutely.
And please include an observation maybe not shared by everyone in this room, but by many of us, that the notion that the committee is not in the business of accrediting is fallacious. It's disingenuous. The reference to a legal issue regarding RAC is resolved and should be a non-issue. The perception issue sounds to me like it's being driven particularly by Lincoln San Jose and perhaps secondarily by Southern California Institute of Law, and they are outliers. Please memorialize those observations in the minutes that are proposed. And it's existential, Leah.
This is,
Yes, Greg.
forgive me. It sounds as if I interrupted someone, my colleague.
You
there. I
did.
apologize.
You interrupted a man. You're being a sexist.
Well, I do apologize. If I could just chime in for a moment, of course, chairing the RAC this year, serving on it for 3 years, serving on a number of bar task forces and working groups. I do want to acknowledge the effort that the staff has put into 2 meetings with the deans, obviously the contentious discussions at times, and the difficulty of those conversations, and the commitment, I would say, to returning recommendations that fully disclose these conversations, including the discord that was observed and the opinions of the deans. I really appreciate the commitment, not only of these several days of work, but also the work ahead in presenting this information completely and accurately to the board members who ultimately have to make these difficult decisions. I want to say, just in respect to accreditation, I feel as though this alternative on which the parties seem to generally agree of acknowledging at least the degree to which an outside accreditor provides assurance of basic consumer protection concerns, that is, that the school is delivering an education of some quality that can be recognized, and the other things that regional and national accreditors are good at and do well, which include things like refund policies and institutional continuity policies and other things that are a part of those accreditations that may in fact provide at least that level of assurance. It seems to me this is a reasonable compromise among parties who can very strongly disagree about a lot of the pieces of it, but it reaches a spot where we can move forward, and it doesn't take away the opportunity for schools who've been accredited for a long time and wish to continue to be accredited by the Committee of Bar Examiners of the State Bar of California to continue to do so under appropriate rules. So I have to say to my colleagues there, I feel pretty good about the staff's ability and willingness to work with us in trying to reach a compromise on some of those very critical issues. And I think some good ideas have been raised respecting the other very difficult issue, which is how to maintain appropriate levels of input from the deans on an ongoing basis. I said in San Francisco that in my experience, there is a continual process of rulemaking that warrants the continued standing committee that we've established and that has been able to perform well and provide a lot of very useful expert input to the regulator. And I would say this is certainly not unprecedented in many other areas of regulation. So I do support and stand by the retention of the RAC. I would be remiss in not mentioning that in my remarks, but I certainly do want to appreciate the progress that has been made and hope that it will be able to persuade the board to embrace this compromise solution along with ultimately retaining the appropriate standing mechanism for input from the deans. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Greg.
Yes.
I want to ask something about timeline for mandatory accreditation. remember when it was brought up in the last couple of years, there was something about 5 years, maybe a maximum of 5 something. Is there any information you can give us about timeline for mandatory accreditation?
So we would be looking to the proposal that was adopted by the Board of Trustees this past November. I can certainly send you a link to that proposal that's on the website. Mitch was helping me recall that we think it was a 7-year timeline to get from to accreditation, but I can certainly send out the link to that proposal.
Ira, some of that was to try to accommodate when, if you decide you're not going to be accredited and no longer have a path to exist, you need to have enough time to stop taking cohorts. I mean, we all know that there's a 4-year lead time right in there if you're going to teach out a reducing cohort. So that was part of the balance. 7 years sounds like a long time, but you really can't get any shorter than that if you're going to give a school time to assess what they're going to do, make a decision, declare it, and then teach out the cohorts they have.
Can I bring up one thing? It's important for those people who are registered and not CALs is what is going to be required, and it might be something that we need to think about, because if you're online, the requirement of fixed facility is different than on online. So some of the things that we had to go through for accreditation no longer apply. And so that's going to be something that the bar needs to take a look at.
Yeah, and that was thought through by the working groups that developed the proposals. It's all merged together into a single proposal, but with Greg Brandis' assistance, we've been sort of teasing apart the two proposals. But yeah, so there wouldn't be a requirement for a physical library for an online school. So we're pulling those pieces.
But that should then be applied across the board, which we have talked about, because if they don't have to have it, then why should a fixed facility have it?
It actually does.
Okay.
It really should. There's a paired restructuring, so where you only have really one set of rules that merged in. So I think you'll see where it does that.
Yeah, and this is Greg again. It's been a long time, so people might not remember that process, but deans of all different types of registered schools were involved on those working groups and had input, and were able to contribute.
So I thank you all for your time today and your input. We will get those recommendations out to you. We're shooting for next week to do that. So you've got time to respond to those. And with that, the meeting is adjourned.
Thank you very much.
This is better.